This is Will Tchakirides interviewing Lucius T. Outlaw Jr. for the HBCU Radio Preservation Project. It is 10:40 a.m. on March 6th, 2025. This interview is being recorded at WFSK Studios on the campus of Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. Dr. Outlaw, first I'm going to ask you, state your full name for the record and tell me what your relationship is to this radio station.
Lucius Turner Outlaw Jr., and as a Fisk alum, I was on the faculty in the 1970s when the first iteration of the radio station was established and went on the air, and was very thrilled by that and supportive of the venture.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take it back a little bit here before we get to that point that you're discussing. Can you tell me when exactly and where you were born?
So I was born in Starkville, Mississippi, 120 miles north of Jackson, 60 miles south of Tupelo, in late December of 1944. So one of the markers of my life is that I'm of the Emmett Till Generation. So that gives you a key marker to understand what my life was like growing up in segregated Starkville, Mississippi.
Yeah, you're alluding to it, and I want to hear in an even deeper way. If this is the motion picture of your life and we're setting the scene in Starkville, what do I see? What do I hear? What do I feel? What is the rhythm of the community?
Interesting question. So for many people who don't have lived experience in Mississippi, they may think of Mississippi through history or movies and think of it as one of the most violent, racially segregated states in the country. Now that's true, but it's not the whole truth. So, and what I mean by that, I grew up in a racially segregated town, Starkville. My father was, all of my growing up life, he was the janitor of the largest white Baptist church in Starkville, First Baptist Church. My mother did day work in the homes of white families most of the time I was growing up. So that meant our lives intersected with white people in all kinds of ways. But those intersections were not all captured by the history and the truthfulness of racial violence. There were relations among white and colored people, as we would call, that also were not in keeping with the rules of racial segregation. There were norms and practices of interaction that were not violent, that were actually sometimes mutually supportive, but you had to know who among white folk were going to be in those roles and on what reasons and to what ends, etc. So part of what you had to grow up learning were who were the good white folks and who were the not good white folks.
And how do you learn that? What is the process of learning who may have solidarity or may be supportive in any way?
First of all, your parents would tell you because they had to know. It was crucial for their well-being. I mean, if you think about this, even in times of enslavement, slaves had to come to some understanding of who were the enslavers, and even among an enslaver's family, who might have slightly different orientations toward enslaved persons. For example, if you were an enslaved woman on a plantation and you were raising the children, how might the children think of you compared to how their father might think of you? The children may have a very different relationship with an enslaved black woman than, say, their father would. Well, because she's caring for them and nurturing them in ways that the father was not. So they began to form certain kinds of attachments to enslaved people. Or take someone like Jimmy Carter, who grew up around black folk in segregation, but there was a black family on his family's farm, but he grew up playing with the kids in their home, sharing meals with them, etc. So this is what I meant by saying that the truth of the violence of racial segregation in a place like Mississippi is not the whole truth. There's a lot more complicated nuance to it than that.
I want to get to more of that, but first I want to know, can you tell me the names of your parents?
Lucius Turner Outlaw Sr. was my father. Lily Mae Brooks Outlaw, my mother.
And where are they from?
They were both born and raised in rural communities just outside the city of Starkville.
And how far back in terms of place can you trace the generations of your family?
Only back through particularly my father's side, to his father and mother. I've done some work on Ancestry.com, but not a whole lot. And on my mother's side of the family, her mother and one of her mother's brothers, my maternal uncle. So they were the sort of core parts of the extended family that I grew up around. They all lived in different rural communities, but spent a lot of time in those communities at their homes and et cetera. So it was a pretty intimate, extended family that we grew up with, that I grew up with in that context. I was an only child. My mother had a younger sister. She spent a lot of time living with us because she would go to school in town until they built a school in the rural community. So she was like my big sister. She's like 2.5 years older than me. So we grew up together, sort of almost as brother and sister.
Was she the closest family member in terms of your relationships with family around your age?
Yeah, who lived in Starkville, but I had a whole bunch of cousins on both my mother's and my father's side. Most of the cousins on my father's side lived in St. Louis, Missouri, because he had two sisters who had migrated to St. Louis, got married, and had families. So those cousins were in St. Louis. On my mother's side, a lot of the family, three of her brothers, for example, had migrated to Chicago. One of my father's brothers migrated to Chicago. So two of my maternal grandmother's sisters migrated to Chicago. So there was a whole complex of family of uncles, aunts, and cousins in Chicago, and aunts, their husbands, and their children in St. Louis. So in those two cities, there was a bunch of extended family.
So your extended family is steeped in the Great Migration story.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And are you and your family traveling to visit with family in St. Louis and Chicago? And what are you seeing and hearing and feeling when you do?
Oh yeah, I have been in Chicago. In St. Louis a number of times because a number of those cousins died. So I would go up for funerals and photograph the funerals in Chicago. Particularly if professional meetings took me to Chicago, then I would connect with the cousins in Chicago. And in fact, had a text message yesterday from one of those cousins about her brother who is back in the hospital for some issues. So I'm constantly in contact with those relatives, those cousins in those two cities. A lot of text messaging goes on fairly routinely with them. And another one of the cousins from St. Louis who went on to have a pretty illustrious, interesting career that would be surprising to most people. He and I are like brothers, and he's now retired living in Las Vegas, but had a very phenomenal, interesting career.
Well, I gotta know now. What was the line of work?
So, do you have an iPhone?
Yes.
He was the chief executive officer of the company that manufactures iPhones.
Wow. Okay.
Responsible for Europe, North America, and South America for this company for years until he retired a few years ago. The only non-Chinese person sitting in the room when all the major stuff is going on with this company called Foxconn, the legendary Foxconn.
Yes. I am familiar with Foxconn. But yeah, that's amazing. So literally changed the game and how we communicate and interact with one another.
Yep.
But getting back, I want to know when you traveled to St. Louis, but also really Chicago, because it is such a significant Great Migration destination. What are you noticing that's different about those urban communities versus the rural community in Starkville, Mississippi that you're coming from?
Yeah, it's interesting. My father, as I said, had a brother who migrated to Chicago. He hoboed a train when he was about 17 and, went to Chicago. My mother had three brothers who migrated to Chicago. And as I said, my maternal grandmother had two sisters who migrated to Chicago. So early, they would often come down, and that was always a big thing. They would come down, and one aunt and her husband would always come down driving a relatively new Buick. They only drove Buicks. And so it would be a big thing. And when her brother would come down in particular, it was a big thing. And then my maternal uncle would often organize family reunions, so people would come in from all over the country, and that was a big thing. There was a lure to Chicago about not being under the auspices of rigid racial segregation. My father never thought that that was quite true. And he always would say, look, this issue is going to really get worked out in the South. The North is really not some heaven, right? And so when I'd go up, there was a greater degree of freedom. All of my family was on the west side of Chicago, which is really interesting. And when I would go up, what I began to quickly learn was how very different social life was in that city in terms of things like violence and gangs. So in my hometown, you literally never locked a door. And if someone came to your house and knocked on the door, wherever you were, you would simply just sort of yell out, "Who is it?" And they would announce their name. You would say, "Well, come on in, and we're back here, Will." And you'd make your way following the sound of our voice to wherever. Well, in Chicago, one of the things you had to learn was you never, ever leave that door unlocked. That door had to always be locked. You had to learn how to negotiate territory with gangs, which I knew nothing about. One day I was up, and this was after I graduated high school. I'd gone to try to find a job, and I was standing. My uncle and aunt lived across the street from a middle school. So I was out watching kids play basketball one day, and there was a Chinese family 2 or 3 doors down from my uncle and aunt's apartment building. And so this Chinese kid and I were standing there watching kids play basketball, and he just sort of eased over next to me and very quietly said, "You better get out of here. They're planning to beat you up." But I had no idea and no clue. And he then quietly walked off the playground and around the fence and just took off running home as fast as he could. And I was like, and he was saying to me, "You better get out of here. You better get out of here." And I finally got out and went home. And so learning about that had a huge impression on me, because it became a place that I didn't like, because, I just began to learn about what are the rules that you got to know. I had to come to know where was the apartment of my uncle and aunt in terms of the territory marked out by 2 competing gangs. And, this was turf over which people would fight to the death. I mean, one of the instructors was late one evening around dusk, young black kid comes walking down the street with like a shotgun. And my cousin was like, "Oh man, something is going to go down. And, we better go see what's happening." We started following, and I'm sitting there thinking, why am I following a guy with a shotgun? And I just stopped and turned around and went back like, this is stupid. I'm not following him. I turned around and went back to the apartment, went in where it was safe and think, this is crazy. I don't want to live like this, And, over time, I came to know what living in Chicago was like for my cousins, and how, for one family in particular, how utterly detrimental it was for them.
So this all must have shaped your decision, not to jump ahead, but to remain in the South, or to not travel to an urban destination? No,
I didn't mind traveling. I didn't. By the time I was ready to go to college, I had, I knew of a number of HBCUs in Mississippi where a lot of people from my hometown went to school, and I had actually visited a number of their campuses. But I had made a determination that I was not going to school in Mississippi, period.
We'll get there soon. Let me first ask, what did education mean to your family? How was it valued in the house? How was it practiced? How did you learn?
So education was highly valued. It was, common regard for education among colored folks, as we call ourselves then, was, if you get that, it can't be taken from you. Number one. Nobody can take that away from you. So get as much education as you possibly can. There was a belief that education was enlightening in ways that would allow you then to become freer. You could make decisions about how to live your life in ways, and you would have a resource you could employ that once you gained it could not be taken from you, and that somehow that resource could be put to use in ways that would be utterly beneficial and help you overcome the restrictions. Why? Well, because one of the rationalizations of racial segregation was the inherent inferiority and ignorance of the Negro. Well, some of the ignorance was true, because if you don't allow people to learn, they will be ignorant. And so you use their ignorance as confirmation of your initial judgment that they're ignorant. Well, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. So early on, black folk had figured out we got to break this vicious circle by making sure that people get educated. And that was always a big thing among colored people across the whole history of our presence in this country. So it was very valued, even though my father finished a rural school. He and my mother got married. She was 15. She only went as far as the 8th grade. But even when I was in high school, my mother hated doing day work in the homes of white families. She absolutely hated doing that kind of work. So she would be taking correspondence courses, learning. And she was very active in Black church organization, the National Baptist Convention. So she was taking courses through church organizations. And even when I was a student at Fisk, she went to a vocational school in a nearby town and finished her high school education. And she and her sister, who had to drop out of school due to pregnancy, she and that baby sister both finished that school about the time I graduated from Fisk, and they graduated.
Wow.
And so education was extremely important in the family. That maternal uncle that I mentioned, he had gone to the Army, came out, went to Rusk College in Mississippi, graduated, and became a teacher and subsequently a principal in his local, well, first in town, because he lived with us and was principal of the middle school, and then he had been principal of a rural country school. So he was an educator. And so education was a big deal. He was the only person in our family who had gone to college.
And was that uncle how you learned about HBCUs?
Well, no, again, I learned about HBCU because they were around in Mississippi, and various people from my high school was going to Jackson State, for example.
Okay.
There were a couple of people who were years ahead of me, including one who became my high school teacher. Well, he had graduated. He was a football player and had played football at Jackson State. Another football player from my high school who was from my church, whose parents and my parents were friends, I sort of grew up going to their home. He played ball at Jackson State and at one point became an All-American. I mean, it was a big deal. Mm. You know, the telephone bit of Ray Self has been, named an All-American. So I knew people going to Jackson State, going to Alcorn, going to Mississippi Valley State. Very few, even went to Tougaloo, which was much more like Fisk. It was private, more selective. There was a nearby junior college, Mary Holmes Junior College, that people went to. So there were schools all around. People from my school were going to Alcorn, Jackson State, Mississippi Valley, Mary Holmes College, etc. One of my best friends had a brother who went to Tennessee State. So my aspiration initially was to go to a school out of state, and it was to go to Tennessee State. And there was something that happened that shifted my focus from Tennessee State to Fisk, which is why I ended up coming here.
That's great. Before we get to your time at Fisk, it sounds like education was a real tool of resistance, a tool of protection, even. How else did your community care for one another in the community? At the start of this interview, you mentioned Emmett Till. There's racial violence and mortal racial violence like that, but also the day-to-day. How did folks care for one another within the Black community in Starkville, Mississippi?
Well, when you start to think about racial segregation, living in it, here's the way in which I put it. Most of the time of me growing up in segregated Starkville, white people were mostly irrelevant. That is to say, all of life is organized around these key institutions and business and segregated life. So that's a sort of world that you're in, and that's sort of normal. Now, when you think of racial segregation, I'm not sure what image comes to mind, but let me paint you a kind of picture.
Please.
So I was born on one side of town. When I was 4, my father had bought a plot of land, used a GI Bill to build a house on another side of town, where several people who had lived on the same other side of town and on the same street, even in a duplex next to her, had bought land and moved to this other side. So there was a sort of migration from east to west over onto what was West Main Street. Now this was a street that ended down here, but it ran all the way through downtown, all the way out the other side to the campus of what is now Mississippi State University. Now, downtown is an interesting story. There was only one business on Main Street downtown. So remind me to come back to that and talk about that. But so that's West Main, and several streets, this whole neighborhood where colored people live. West Main is intersected by Long Street. West Main continues all the way to downtown, to the business district downtown. Now, on Long Street, from one block was from a major highway to West Main. In that block, only colored people lived on both sides of Long Street from that highway, and on the other side of the highway, the whole neighborhood is colored. Where Long Street intersects with West Main, this section of Long Street from West Main to another street, only white people live. From Long Street on West Main, for one block on both sides, all of the homes are those of white people. In the next block, going down a hill up to downtown, there are 1, 2 white homes, then the rest are colored. On the other side, all colored. So I'm saying, you said, well, it's segregated. What are the dividing lines? There are no visible lines. You just know in this block, colored people, in this block, white people. There are no signs. In this block, white people on both sides. In the next block, white people, colored people.
So sort of real estate demarcations.
Yeah, but I mean, there are no signs. There's no matter saying you, et cetera, et cetera. It's just, those are the rhythms and patterns of life. Now, how do people live those rhythms and patterns of life? In some very interesting kinds of ways. Right? Well, here's an example. So in high school, I'm dating a girl. I go courting on Sunday. Often her mother and father are sitting on the front porch, chilling out on a Sunday afternoon. I speak, and the father says, "Hi, afternoon, son. Go in the living room. She'll be out in a little while," etc. That father was white. The mother was Negro. Now, she and I dated for several years in high school. We never discussed her father. Not because it was a taboo topic. That was her father. I knew that was her father. Her father and mother had several children. She was not the first nor the last. And that was a relationship between this colored woman and this white man that was known to everybody. Everybody was, yeah.
Would that have been a common occurrence, a common relationship?
It wasn't common, but it wasn't unusual. One of my best friends had met and married a woman when he went to an HBCU, and they were back in town, and she had become a good friend of my mother. My mother, mentored her into the church and into women's alternative love, and they were close. And his parents had been friends of my parents. We grew up and went to school together, and we're still to this day very close friends. But anyway, she and my mother was in the hospital before she died, and they were there, and I went home, and we met up, and we were getting ready to leave the hospital, and she said, Starkville is a funny town. She had born and raised in another town west of Starkville. And as I said, she and my best friend met in college. And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "This is a funny town." I said, what do you mean? She said, well, just look at the colored people. I'm like, okay, what about them? And so then she started pointing to particular families of colored people. Okay. I went, oh, yeah. So the families she was talking about, if you looked at them, you would be wondering, are they colored? Because in one of those families, I went all the way through school they had 15 children. 2 of the girls were in my class. Oh, God, were they fine.
So there's a history of racial mixture in this town, in this community.
Oh, well, those girls, I learned later from one of their half-brothers who was a best friend, who didn't live with them. Their grandmother was this old woman that the guys and I sort of hated, because if you were trying to sneak over to see these girls while their parents were away, grandmother would run you away. I didn't learn until this half-brother told me that one grandmother was a white woman. She had gotten pregnant in another town and had moved to Starkville to give birth to a kid that became their father. So she's living, and then he marries another colored woman, very light-skinned. So all these young people, like these girls, like had green eyes, very, very light-skinned. And so there were a number of colored people. So, for example, I said there was one business on Main Street, only one business on Main Street, downtown in the business district, owned by a colored man. He had a particular last name. About 3 doors west of, and he owned a barber shop with 4 black barbers, but the clientele was white only. I shined shoes in that barber shop, only white clientele. The man who owned that shop was also the treasurer of my church, so I knew him in a number of capacities. About 3 doors to the west of his barbershop on the same side of the street was a drugstore owned by a white man. They both had the same last names. Now, if you looked at the man who owned the barbershop, who was the treasurer in my church, you would immediately begin, is he colored? Because he could just as easily have passed for white. So I think they had the same father, but different mothers. But he had been set up with a business on Main Street. A few doors down was, I think, a half-brother who lives as a white man. Both businesses on Main Street in downtown Starkville.
Conferred a certain status. So there are stark lines of separation between races, but there's also a level of social intimacy among them within your community.
Yeah.
Now, in that story you just told, there are 2 aspects of it I want to ask some questions about.
Mm-hmm.
You've mentioned the church. Was it the Baptist church?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about how life at the church structured community life, your family life. What did the church mean to y'all?
Well, churches were gathering places for all kinds of things. First of all, you've got religiosity going on, worship, all of that. But they are also social organizations, and within which people have, given the structure of the church, you have people in various roles. So you've got deacons, missionary societies. Well, missionary societies are made up fundamentally of women. Well, these women are carrying out certain kinds of things like going visit people seeing to the sick, for example. Deacons are carrying out certain kinds of roles. The minister has certain kinds of roles. People are serving as Sunday school teachers. So there are various functions happening there, and the church becomes a place around which certain kinds of community things happen. For example, my church, Second Baptist, was the place where several young men who were members of the church formed a Boy Scout troop. I was in that Boy Scout troop. Our meetings were held on a certain night each week in the basement of that church. So now you can see that church is becoming kind of a nurturing ground for not just religiosity, but for the development of young men now through scouting. And as I said, one of the young men who went to Jackson State playing football after graduation had come back and been hired by Boy Scouts of America as one of the colored people who's going around the state seeing to the formation and nurturing of black scout troops. And every spring there would be what was called a jamboree, where troops would come together for 2 or 3 nights for various competitions and camping and living in tents and all of that stuff. So all of that nurturing is going on. But remember, he's also been a teacher in the school, a coach of the football team. So all of those institutions are nurturing you in various kinds of ways. And in my high school, part of what got nurtured was a certain kind of arrogance. Right? And what I mean by that is, as I said, there are ways in which white folk were sort of irrelevant. You know, we didn't spend our time wanting to be white or wanting to be like white folk. We thought we were pretty damn cool, that our girls were pretty fine. So most of the time we weren't spending our time worrying about white people.
You had a sense of cultural pride. And
And, you know, you've got competition going on with other colored schools and, you know, which is the best among them, who's going to win the championship. In my high school, you know, our football team was like champions several years running. The girls' basketball team, I was watching, I guess last night, I know what it was. Vanderbilt has a young black woman on their women's basketball team who a couple of nights ago scored 50-some points. Well, on the girls' basketball team in my high school, when I was in high school, one of my classmates was a girl who routinely would score 50-some points. I mean, they were so dominant, a lot of other teams didn't like to play us because they would just be blowouts. And interesting, you may not be old enough to know this. I don't know if you knew that early on, girls' basketball teams only played half court.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Right. So the teams would be 6 each. So there would be 3 on defense and 3 on offense. So the team on defense, if one team shot the ball and the other team, a girl from the other team rebounded, she had to get that ball, had to come to the half-court line and be passed to the offensive group. They couldn't go across half-court line.
But they would sub out lines for defense and offense?
No, there were 3 on offense, 3 on defense. And the other team had 3 on offense and 3 on defense, right? So there were 6 for each team on the floor at a time, but the game had to be played on half courts. So if an offensive team shot the ball and an defensive player got the rebound, that player had to get the ball, the defensive team had to get the ball back to the half court, and they couldn't go over the half court line because that would be a foul, an infraction. So they couldn't step over that line. Furthermore, they could only bounce the ball 3 times and then have to pass it. If you bounce it 4 or whatever, you were traveling. These were restrictions only that the girls had. Boys didn't have those restrictions. And our coach had worked out a strategy by which he had, the defensive team had to get that ball. There was a way in which they had to move that ball among the 3 of them, getting it back to half court. The offensive team was set up in a special way that ball then went to one of them in a particular positions, and each of them had 2 dribbles. Now remember, they can only dribble twice. A 3rd time is an infraction. So they had developed a routine of 2 dribbles pass, 2 dribbles pass, 2 dribbles pass, and a 3rd pass had to be to this girl who was the top scorer, and she had 2 dribbles, and she'd better be putting that ball up. And they just worked it like a well-oiled machine, and they just blew people away. And she would score like 50 points,
Sounds poetic. It's like jazz moving around.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I'm interested in this idea you're sort of speaking to of integration versus segregation, I imagine the issue is really like a matter of resources and ensuring that communities can build power. And I'm wondering how you think about integration versus maybe maintaining separation, but what if the community was equally resourced and had all it needed to succeed and was healthy and safe and not under attack?
Mm-hmm.
What are the benefits? What are the costs of integration, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, those were the lessons that learned after desegregation.
Yeah.
And it turns out that the costs were really very high. You see, I mean, for me, and this became a matter of very serious concern over the course of my career, because given my background, my interest in philosophy is fundamentally about social and political philosophy. So thinking about strategies was something I spent 50 years wrestling with. And, the desegregation effort became conflated with integration. And that conflation involved a strategic decision that I think my own self was deeply flawed. Now, what I mean, if you go back and look at the court case that led to Brown v. Board of Education, the argument that the NAACP Legal and Education Defense Forum made was that segregation is harmful to Negro children. And there was a bunch of social scientific research that got presented that had been developed by this husband and wife team.
The Clarks, yeah.
Yes, about the harmful effects in the 1940s doll study, for example. Okay. So the argument became, and what the Supreme Court, they were persuaded, and if you read the opinion by Earl Warren, who wrote the opinion for them, was that segregation is harmful to Negro children. That harm will prevent them from growing up and being able to fully exercise their rights as citizens. It is impairing their citizenship, therefore it is wrong. Now, the argument that the NAACP Legal and Education Defense Forum was making was that, here's an argument they didn't make. They didn't make the argument that there was a maldistribution of resources. That was not an argument that they made. Because if you go back to Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the argument they made separate but equal. Now, what they knew was that the resource distribution was not equal. But they didn't go after the resource distribution issue.
Right.
I think for a particular set of compelling reasons. Those reasons, the McCarthy era.
Mm.
What's McCarthy accusing people of?
Disloyalty.
No.
Say it.
Communism.
Well, yes,
That's the big issue.
Mm-hmm.
They're communists in our midst. I've got evidence of so-and-so is a
disloyal
communist.
communists.
Right? So if you think back to communist and socialist arguments, at the core of them is an argument about capitalism, who's commanding the resources and who's not. So if the NAACP Legal Defense Forum was already being charged as being infiltrated and led by communists, particularly because there are a number of prominent white and Jewish lawyers involved in this. So the tag of communism. So I think they strategically did not adopt a line of argument that would be easily identified as having to do with communism. Instead, they took a different route. Our children are being put in schools that are malnourished institutions. We need to end this. We need to put the children in the schools where the resources are abundant. Well, why would you do that? Well, if the Negro children are in the same schools with white kids, you're not going to be able to harm the Negro children by denying them resources, because to do that, you'd have to deny the white kids. So you're not going to do that. So if we put them in the same school, we can be assured that our kids are going to get the same kind of resources as the white kids. Okay, but what about all that you had with the colored schools? That wasn't thought through. Now, if you look at the way it played out in, say, in Mississippi, where there was a determined effort, said, oh, okay, we know how to play this game. So they just began to make sure then that all of the Negro schools were subordinated to the white schools. Negro principals, dismissed. Negro sports teams, eliminated. Negro mascots, eliminated. So I grew up with a band, had our own band, our own majorettes, our own football team, our own basketball team, our own baseball team, our own uniforms, all the cultural accoutrements of a shared communal life in which the schools were a big deal. I mean, the last game of the football season was always played on Thanksgiving Day. It was a huge ritual. You didn't have Thanksgiving dinner until that game was over. And it was always played against neighboring Columbus, Mississippi, one of our biggest rivals. So all that institutional rivalry stuff, etc. Once you go into the predominantly white schools and all of that cultural infrastructure is eliminated, that's gone. I got invited back some years ago to Starkville to be inducted into the Hall of the Famous at Starkville High School. Well, Starkville High was the name of the white school. I was in W.C. Henderson, which was the name of the school I went to, named after the colored principal. So I'm being inducted into a Hall of the Famous at a school I never set foot in, except one day they were working it when they were building it.
Wow.
I didn't go there. And by the time when I went back for this induction ceremony, 80% of the students in that school were colored. All the white kids, except for a small 20% portion, had moved to a new campus that you could see from that building that was a private Christian school filled with white kids.
They fled.
The whole white flight thing went up. And so you can see now what the cultural infrastructure that I was nurtured in was virtually gone.
I mean, that's really profound because you're speaking to a loss of resources and economic infrastructure, institutional infrastructure, but there's also a loss of cultural memory or an annihilation of cultural memory when you remove entire school systems and districts. And that example is really powerful. You're coming back to this school that wasn't your school. What does that mean in terms of the loss of that memory of your time coming up?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because, the superintendent is a kid that I went to school with. He was a year or so ahead of me. We had overlapping relationships in all kinds of ways. So in one sense, it seems like progress. But there's a transformation and something that's being lost, et cetera. In my hometown, every 2 years there's a school reunion of the old Octavia County Training School, W.C. Henderson High School, et cetera. And a lot of us who went through those schools are dying off now, So it's as an attempt to preserve that memory and to have these reunions, and it's really, really interesting to do that. But it made for it. Now, I went back. I had a really interesting experience. Once my parents were still alive, I went back to visit them, and so we needed something, and I needed to go to the grocery store. So I got in the car and drove to the local grocery store. I'd grown up, it's a Kroger grocery store. I grew up growing at Kroger's, et cetera. And I walked into the store, and I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. I just stopped and like, what the hell? So there was two young people working in the store. Each had on a colored vest that employees wear in the store. And they were standing having a conversation. It was a young black man and a young white woman standing in the store having a conversation. Well, I was dumbfounded because that wouldn't happen when I was a kid growing up. Talk about taboo. I mean, as I said, I'm in the Emmett Till generation.
Mm-hmm.
So they were standing having a conversation. I just stopped and looked like, what is going on? And they finished that conversation, and he went one way, she went one way, and then she turned and speaking sort of loud enough for him to hear across a couple of miles, and, so. And his response was, "Oh yeah, okay, I'll stop by later tonight." And then they went on about their business. I'm standing there going, what in the world is going on here? And my revelation was, this place has changed. I hated going home to Mississippi. I hated it. It was like, whenever I went back, it was like this dark cloud of gloom. I hated going back, and I was like, this is not the same Starkville. And another occasion, I was back visiting my parents. I think my mother was there, my father was there, and I was going downtown to a restaurant that had good hamburgers, and I was waiting at park and was getting ready to walk the street, and a BMW pulled up to a traffic light on Main Street and then turned and came right past me. Driving the BMW was a young African-American. Sitting very close to him in the front seat was a young white girl. And I was like, wow, this place is different. Right? So, and while I was here on the faculty, I was director of the honors program. There was a meeting at Mississippi State of honors programs of state. So I took a group of students and we went down. It turns out that that girl I dated, who had, she was biracial, she was home visiting her mother. She had actually married a guy who was a very, very, very prominent pro football player. They lived in Detroit. He played for the Detroit Lions. So she was home visiting her mother, and I knew it because we had been in contact and stuff. And so I was married, had a kid. She was married, had 2 kids. And so, she was home, and I said, hey, I knew she was going to be there. I said, hey, I'm going to be coming to town. Why don't you hang around till I get there? And so I contacted her. I said, look, there's a closing banquet on Saturday night. Why don't you come go with me and you can meet the students and blah, blah, blah. So she did. So I went out to pick her up. And so when I got there, she was in her room getting dressed. And so I sat in the bedroom. It was in the fall. Her mother was in the bedroom with a fire in the flash. And she and her mother and I were just talking, catching up on all that. And she walked out of the bedroom and I said, okay, Mother, I'm ready. And Mother, I'll see you later. And I said, yeah, you look nice. She said, but Lucius, tell her to take that off. And I said, take off what? She said, that wig. I said, wig? She had this big, beautiful afro. And I said, wig? I'm like, girl, go take that wig off. And so she was like, there you and Mom go, ganging up on me. And so she goes into the bedroom, and a few minutes later, she walks out of the bedroom and said, okay, I'm ready. And I was shocked, but I didn't say anything. So we get up, say goodnight to her mother. We go out, we walk to my car. We get in the car, we drive to the campus, and we park, and we get out, and I just stopped and started laughing. She said, what's wrong with you? And I said, girl, if we had done this when we were in high school, I'd probably be killed. She's like, what are you talking about? When she came out of the bedroom, after having taken off the wig, she had long blonde hair down past her shoulders. I had never in my life ever seen her with blonde hair, ever. And when she walked out, my first reaction was, Martha's a white girl? What am I saying? And so I didn't say anything because she was like, what are you talking about? Well, we went to the bank, we came back, and we got back and were sitting in the living room. We talked till like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, I've never seen you with blonde hair. She said, no, that's because I hated my blonde hair. So when I was, she said, I always dyed it. I'd only seen her with very short hair that was very dark black, dark brown. I'd never seen her blonde. And so to see her blonde and then thinking, oh my God, is she white? And we talked, I said, we never had a conversation about your racial identity. And when we were in high school, we dated. She says, what was there to discuss? I was colored. I said, we never discussed your father. Yeah. And I'm like, I realized, yeah, I discussed. I was just hoping he wouldn't shoot me because he was a daddy. But the fact that he was white had never been an issue for me at all. That was her father. So,
But thank you for sharing that story. Before we get to Fisk, though, you mentioned the Boy Scout group meeting in the church. Were there ever any political organizations meeting, or did folks in the community ever organize in response to either violence or anything that might be repressing the community?
So, good question. So, my church during my time never became a site of organizing. the deacon board, those people, including my father, were super conservative and didn't want that because for them it would become a magnet for violence.
Mm.
Now, a group of young people came into town to try to do voter registration organizing, and they were members of SNCC.
Tell me about that.
And, well, that was really provocative for a lot of people, both colored and white, because for a lot of the colored people, like my father had figured out ways to accommodate to the racial situation and had worked out his own strategies. And he had said to me once, for example, he said, "Son, you can't go over white people. You can't go around white people. You can't go through white people. You've got to learn how to work with white people in a way to get them to do what you want them to do." And I had watched in various ways how he would do that, how he could work the manipulation to get what he wanted, what he needed. And one of the things he said to me was, for example, always know your banker. So when I got ready to come to Fisk, he had to go borrow the money. Well, if he didn't have a certain relationship with the banker, that wasn't going to happen. Right? So he had worked out strategies of accommodation, and he was not in favor of any frontal assault on racial segregation, and didn't want me involved when I came to Fisk when the movement was when students were doing that. I was strictly forbidden not to get involved because of what may happen to them or what may happen to me. So my church was a very conservative. Now, that was a colored doctor in my town who became active in NAACP and became very active in organizing, but the church was not a basis for that. And there were younger people who began to connect with the SNCC people, who later on connected with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, who were involved in an attempt to get seated at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, where Fannie Lou Hamer was, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired," and that whole thing. Well, there were people from my hometown, and interestingly, one of the people in that group was a young man I grew up with, who was notorious as a bad kid who had been to reform school, etc. Now he's involved in politics, interesting way, etc. So, one way to put it is that most of the folk and colored men in my hometown, save for this doctor and maybe a couple of others, were more akin to Booker T. Washington than W.B. Du Bois. And it was about how do you accommodate. And my father was, this is going to get worked out eventually. You got to be patient. You can't force this, demonstrations and all of that. In fact, when James Meredith was admitted to the University of Mississippi and all this violence broke out, we were on the verge of violence in Starkville because it was on a Sunday, and I had been somewhere to a church event with my mother and a grandmother, and I was driving a car. And we came back into town over by the university on a highway. And as we came over a hill, I looked down. The highway was literally blocked and covered with young white men marching in the highway. And I'm like, parade on a Sunday afternoon? And my mother's like, stop the car. And so I'm stopping. She's like, get out of here. So I had to back up and turn around because I'm trying to figure what is going on. Because we didn't know that Meredith had been forcibly brought to the university with the, calling out the troops and all of that. And these young white guys were protesting. So they had marched to the colored side of town. They had marched down past the home of the colored doctor who was an activist in the NAACP and all of that. And so I had to find a different route, go back home, et cetera. So the next day in school, this becomes a topic of discussion, right? So this gets to be a heated discussion. The principal, another long story, if you saw him, you would think he was white. His daughter taught in the school. She had 3 children, the oldest of whom was a girl in my class. So we got into this heated discussion in class about Meredith going to the University of Mississippi. And her position was Negroes need to learn to stay in their place, which was sort of her grandfather's thing. And my position was my dad had paid taxes just like everybody else. We should be free to go to any school we want to. So we got in a heated discussion. So she got really upset and got up and stormed out of class and went down to the principal and told her grandfather. So we're in this particular favorite English teacher's class, and shortly thereafter, the intercom goes on. In her room, Mrs. Stewart, it was the principal, "Is Mr. Outlaw in your class?" "Yes." Send them down to the office. She's like, Lucius, why can't you just be quiet? I get up and go down to the principal's office. I get there. It's the principal, the assistant principal, who's a cousin of my father, and my father. They've called my father. Now, he works at First Baptist White Churches downtown. He's a 5-minute drive away. They've called him. He's enough. I go into the office. There are these 3 grown men, and they're all saying to me, you need to leave this alone. This is the powder keg issue. You need to stop talking about this shit. And I'm like, no. Nope. You know, I'm like, no, I'm not backing down from this, you know. And my father was like, boy, your mouth is going to get you in so much trouble. Your mouth is going to get you in so much trouble.
How did it feel to kind of stand your ground in that moment in terms of your conviction?
Well, I mean, I wasn't going to give in. Mm-hmm. And, you know, again, my father's saying, well, your mouth is going to get you in trouble. I'm like, okay, but I'm not giving in.
You mentioned the sort of dichotomy, Booker T and Du Bois. Where did you fall along those lines? I'm sure, you know, I hear in your voice, you listened to your parents and you respected what they were saying, but where did you fall on it internally, if not externally?
In between. I mean, at that point, I hadn't read Du Bois, right? So when I came into Fisk in 1963, there was still a very powerful desegregation movement underway, and lots of young people were participating. And my first year, Martin Luther King Jr. came to speak in the gym over here. And there's an interesting part of the history of what I grew up with has a lot to do also with radio.
Tell me about it.
Right. So there was, in Nashville, one of the most powerful radio stations in the country, WLAC, a 100,000-watt radio station. Really, really powerful, right? And depending on what's happening on the sun, those radio waves could sometimes be picked up even in the Caribbean. Now, the DJs were white, but starting about 6 p.m. each day, the music format went to an all-colored format. And particularly on weekdays, it was R&B. Now, those broadcasts were sponsored by 2 white establishments, one down on Church Street called Buckley's Record Shop, another out in Gallatin called Randy's Record Shop. And they would sponsor the broadcast of all that music by putting together packages of records of popular colored music. And they would be advertised and sold by the DJs on the show. So let's say there was a very popular Otis Redding song where they would package that with, say, 3 or 4 others. And they would give the packages a name. And so you could then just contact or write to Buckley's or Randy's and order so-and-so package. Some packages may come with bonuses like a box of baby chickens. Right? Wow. And so when I came to Fisk, one of the early things I did was to go down to church and see, you know, Buckley's. I played baseball, and once we were traveling, going out of town past in Gallatin, I'm like, oh, God, there's Randy's. But we grew up listening at night to WLAC radio station.
And you listened to it at home growing up as a teenager?
Oh, yeah. I mean, at night, because the local radio station, interestingly, had a racially mixed musical program all the time. Right? So I grew up at night listening to all these white artists, including country, but also regularly in the rotation would be Ray Charles, Johnny Mathis, any number of very prominent vocalists, because it was sort of a easily listening WSSO radio station. So black music, and on Sunday mornings, they had programming exclusive of black gospel quartet. They had regular programming every Sunday morning. And there were times I was on the radio station because something was done at my church. So it's this really interesting thing. But radio, particularly WLAC, was a powerful influence. We grew up listening because that became the avenue where you would then know about and get access to all this recorded music.
So you snuck it in there. You said there were times when you were on radio because of your church. What did you mean by that?
Oh, so there may be a radio program, and my church was figuring they would feature, say, young people.
Okay.
And so I may be on with some group speaking about whatever. So yeah, I mean, that was very typical of the radio station. This is what I meant by the, you can have a sense of racial segregation as completely two worlds that never met. Those worlds are intersecting all kinds of ways. There are norms. Now, there are laws against what you don't do, but those norms involve breaking of the laws all kinds of ways, but they're structured in certain ways. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not standing in a store. If I'm in a store buying something and the cashier is a young white girl, she and I are not going to have a conversation. I had an interesting thing. So my father was janitor of First Baptist Church. At one point, my first job, starting about 9 years old, was to clean the building that was the nursery building. My father, so I would go up on Saturday morning, clean that, and blah, blah. As I got older, one of my jobs became to cut the grass at the parsonage where the minister lived. So one Saturday, and it would be sort of routine, I would go out Saturday morning and I'd cut the grass, and they like to have the grass cut using a push mower because they like the texture of that the push mower. You may not know about a rotary push mower. Yeah, and they like the way that looked, and if you did it a certain kind of way, it had an interesting pattern to the grass cut. So they liked it, and that was what I had to do. And they had their house was on a corner, because they had a big yard. And typically, by the time I'm about done, the wife would prepare a meal, which then I would eat by myself in the garage. But one Saturday, and they had a daughter, a single child. So one Saturday, as I was cutting grass, the daughter came out with like a pitcher of lemonade in a glass and walked up to me and said, my mother thought you might like something cool to drink. And so I stopped, and she poured it, I took it, I drank it, and we may have exchanged a couple of words, and I finished drinking and handed it, and she turned and walked away. So the next day or so later, my father walked into my bedroom one night and said, you don't have to go cut the grass at the parsonage anymore. That's all he said. I was like, okay. Now, it didn't take me long to figure out what that was about. A teenage black male and a teenage white female standing in this white neighborhood on a corner lot in broad open daylight, having an intimate in the sense of two human beings, one giving him something to drink in the hot Mississippi sun. No, that wasn't. He was concerned
about your safety.
Well, not just my safety. It was concerned about breaking the most taboo protocol in the whole. Remember
all of your safety.
Yeah, I mean, you see, I mean, here's a deeper understanding I got about that. So, if you think about arguments about white racial supremacy, okay, mm-hmm. So there's supposed to be something about the physical racial makeup of white people that makes them superior. Okay, where does that lie? Now, it can't lie with white males. Why not? There's no restriction on with whom white males can have sex. That doesn't endanger racial purity. So who's the key to racial purity?
Women.
White females. So if they are the key to the physical racial purity of white people, you cannot allow contamination of her purity by sexual intercourse with non-white males. That is why all that violence begins to surround black male, white female interactions that could lead to intercourse.
Bring it back to Emmett Till.
That's right. That's exactly what that's about. that must be prevented at all cost. Now, that's a danger to black males. It is also an imprisonment of white females. Because now you carry the burden of the purity of the white race. Now, for some white women, that's cool. That's a good thing. For them, they're like, yeah, we'll take all that privilege. You're in prison, but I'm well taken care of. But then there begin to be a whole bunch of white women who are like, nah, second generation feminist movement? Nah, we're not accepting that. But that's the heart of the thing that you have to learn early on. That this is the one taboo you don't break at the threat of your very life.
And your parents work to teach you that.
Yeah. I have 3 granddaughters. 2 of them are white. 3 daughters-in-law. White.
Yeah.
All 4 of my grandchildren are biracial.
Yeah.
For an old boy of the Emmett Till generation. And
what do you think about that?
What is, a number of things. One is that, here are young women that if you were to try to persuade them to act like the woman who told that lie about Emmett Till, they would look at you and think you were out of your damn mind. I mean, I've spent 40 years teaching in predominantly white institutions. And I say, if you took a program from the Ku Klux Klan, didn't put their name on it, and have it written out and give it to the average white kid in college and say, read this, and it's from an organization, and read it and see if you want to join. And they'd read it and go, this is stupid. Right? Mm-hmm. Now, part of that is what has happened over the last decades of integrated education, multiculturalism, et cetera, that the average young white kid in certain educational brackets in particular, if you tried to get them to become explicit white supremacists, they'd be like, that's stupid. Now, there are a whole bunch of frustrated young white men who think that that's the resource they need to grab on now. They allow people to convince them that the problem that they are having in their life has to do with black people. No, but that's been going on since the country was founded. So all of the work is not finished. But there are a whole generation of white folk who are like, that's stupid. That's just stupid.
Yeah. I got to get us to Fisk. So when you first stepped foot on this university's campus that we're sitting in right now, what do you see? What do you hear? Describe the sort of cultural environment and what you notice first and what stands out in your memory as a student.
Well, we have to go back a little bit. So, as I said, I was not going to go to school at College of Mississippi, right? So I had learned about, because one of my best friend's brother was at Tennessee State. Okay, I want to go to Tennessee State. Now, there's a part I haven't told you about is in high school becoming a preacher. That's another whole complicated story.
You thought about it?
No, I was doing it.
You were already doing it, okay.
Right. And so I want to go study religion and philosophy, right? And so I'm wanting to go to Tennessee State. Now, I was another young Negro, as we said at the time, who was studying at American Baptist College. And he was preaching. We happened to be at some religious service event, et cetera, and we're talking, hey, what are you going to do for college? I said, well, I want to go to Tennessee State. I want to study, philosophy and religion, blah, blah. He says, can't do that at Tennessee State, but there's another school there called Fisk University where you can study philosophy. And I'm like, Fisk? He said, yeah. He says, really good school. And he says, and by the way, they had the most beautiful black women in the world at Fisk. I'm like, okay. So I'd never heard of it. So I started getting information on Fisk, and so I applied. And when I told my minister about that, he was like, oh, goodness. I don't think you're going to be able to get into Fisk. Nobody from my hometown had ever gone to Fisk. Nobody. Mm-hmm. Right? So, and interestingly, when I applied, my transcript had to be sent. Well, I wasn't hearing from Fisk. When I contacted them, they said, we don't have your transcript. And I'm like, what? So I go to the principal's office. I find out the principal hadn't allowed my transcript to be sent to Fisk. So I called my dad. The assistant to the principal working in the office is a young colored woman who's actually a cousin of my father. And she's like, yeah, he won't. My father comes over to there and basically says to the principal, you better get his transcript off and up to Fisk University. So he complied. Well, I get admitted, interestingly. But they say to me, well, we're not going to give you a scholarship. We're not sure. We got to see how you're going to do, whether you're going to be able to make it here, blah, blah, blah. So I said, okay. So my father went and mortgaged the house, got the money to cover my first year.
Wow.
And said, this is it. You're going to be on your own. I'm like, okay. So when it was time to come up, we packed me up, and the three of us got in the car. I'm driving. We drove to Nashville. We get here, and we drive down 17th Avenue out here, and I pull up in front of the student union, and I stop and got to figure out where do I need to go. And I'm sitting there, and there's a young woman walking down the oval from Jubilee Hall toward the car where we're parked in front of the student union. And I'm looking at her. She's in this immaculately fitting suit with high-heeled shoes on, her hair done up in some elaborate kind of way. And I'm sitting there going, oh my God. Oh.
Where am I?
Where, right? And so, I move around, and that day I start, getting in, and, where I got to go over here, sign up to get lunch cards, and I'm looking at all these women like, oh my God. I go to my dorm, which used to be right down here. They tore it down. I'm meeting guys, and, I'm in my father's 1956 Ford. I had got on my best favorite outfit. I had on a pair of white low-cut tennis shoes, a pair of khaki pants, my favorite red bandlawn shirt. You may not know about bandlawn, a synthetic nylon, and matching red socks, right? So I'm clean, I thought. We're parked getting out. A Lincoln Continental pulls up beside us. Young man gets out wearing a gray shark skin suit in a Lincoln Continental. I'm looking at him going, damn, he's in my class. He's out of Memphis. I go up, and later I get into my room. I'm sitting around, and a kid walks down the hall. He's in a blue suit, a blue button-down shirt, and a necktie. It's like he stepped off the pages of Gentleman Quarterly's magazine, and we start meeting. Hey, where you from? I'm from Mississippi. One question. Well, where'd you go to high school? And I tell him, I said, where'd you go to high? He was from Baltimore. He says, oh, I graduated from Baltimore City College. And I'm like, oh, Jesus. He's already finished one college, and he's not. I didn't know his name of my high school. I've worked in Baltimore. Yeah, he and I are still very close friends to this day. And I'm meeting these guys, and, I'm at one of the early things you get, you're here for orientation for about a week. One of the most impactful, and I was writing to a classmate about it just yesterday. So you're sitting in the chapel, and an official is greeting you and laying out the sort of protocols of what it means to be at Fisk. And then he says, shake hands with the person on your right. Now shake hands with the person on your left. And he says, one of you will not be here in 4 years.
Now, knowing the pressure that your father mortgaged the house for you to get in, how are you feeling hearing that?
Okay. Oh, this is what this is about. And there's a joke circulating among students that says something like, look, if you're not serious at Fisk, the university is going to give you a comic book, a banana, and a one-way bus ticket home. Start a second semester of my first year. Go to the dining hall, sit with friends, and they said, oh, did you hear about so-and-so? No, what about so-and-so? It's not here anymore. Like, what do you mean he's not? This is a classmate. He punched out. Punched out means flunked out. Dismissed. Now, this was a kid who'd gone to boarding school in New York, in the East Coast. I didn't know black people went to boarding school. I was in Boy Scouts, so I had this magazine called Boy's Life. Everything in there is about white people. And in the back there are all these ads from boarding schools. So for me, that's what white folk did. I didn't know black. I had a whole bunch of classmates who had gone to boarding schools in New England. I didn't, right? This kid had gone to boarding school. His father was a multimillionaire from Memphis. I didn't know there were black millionaires. His father had been on the board. His sister had already graduated from Fisk. My daddy was a janitor. My mama was a maid. My mother didn't even finish high school. And I'm up here with people with these kind of pedigree. I mean, kids are meeting each other saying, hey, I remember you from the Jack and Jill convention. What the hell is Jack and Jill? It's a social organization of black middle class. And they have annual conventions all around the country. They're going and meeting one another and saying, I didn't know anything about Jack and Jill. Right? And these are the people I'm in school with, and it's like, how the hell am I going to survive? There was a whole group of guys who were selected for a special dorm of honor students only, where they had their meals together every night. And I'm like, Jesus Christ.
Well, given this sort of culture shock, what was your tactic to survive?
Study myself. I mean, as I was writing to a classmate yesterday, I probably never went to bed before 1 or 2 a.m. from Sunday night to Thursday night. I worked like hell. Because if I didn't do well and begin to qualify for a scholarship, I was going to be out because my father had money for 1 year. That was it.
Did you feel like you had to make sacrifices in your social life on campus to study more?
Yeah, I mean, my social life had to be secondary. Look, I mean, even by the time I was a senior and I had a girlfriend, and in fact, this morning we became engaged and then we broke off and I married somebody else. But we've been exchanging texts just the last couple of days. I heard from her this morning before I left home. Even with my girlfriend, it was like, okay, what are we going to do? Let's get it done because I have to go study. Right? It was like I pledged a fraternity, and my determination was, I'm not going to let my grades drop when I'm pledging. If not, I'll drop off of this stuff. I mean,
which fraternity?
Alpha Phi Alpha. Okay. One of the oldest, most prestigious, et cetera, one of the first black fraternities. And so I became utterly dedicated. But the other thing was this place was such an incubation about excellence. And as I said, you didn't perform well. You were out. They didn't care who your parents were. You know, I tell people, a lot of schools now are proud of their retention rates. At that time, Fisk didn't care about retention. Either you performed or you were out. I mean, my sophomore year, second semester, I'm living in this building, down on the second floor. I get up about 1 o'clock in the morning. I go out of my room to the bathroom. Hey, Lou, what's happening? Fraternity brothers down the hall at the water fountain. Hey, what's you up to? I said, yeah, I'm booking, trying to get ahead. It's the start of the second semester. Yeah, I come out of the bathroom. I don't see him. I go, finish. And later that day, as usual, go to the dining hall for lunch. Guys from the same fraternity, sorority would get together, And so I'm with a bunch of girls, and they said, hey, did you hear about so-and-so? And so I said, well, what do you mean? Not here. I said, where you be? He's not. Oh, he punched out. He's gone. I'm like, I saw him in the hallway about 2 o'clock this morning. Turns out he was up packing. Roommates in the bed asleep. Sun comes up. He's gone. I mean, they did not play, didn't tolerate. Now, there's other dimensions of this for me that I thought about transferring once. I had gone to Dartmouth on exchange, and it was very interesting because I lived in a fraternity house, which is of white guys, but it was a very unique fraternity, non-secret. It already had a black member, other young men of color, and it was a fraternity of all the BMOCs at Dartmouth, the big men on campus. Manager of the radio station, editor of the newspaper, captain of the soccer team. When I got there, I mean, here was my entry into the fraternity. I was supposed to stay in a dorm. I get to campus. I go to that dorm, to that room. The young man says, oh, no, actually, I was an exchange student, so I went to Dartmouth, and a Dartmouth student came to Fisk.
Okay.
So we exchanged.
First semester?
Yeah. And so he says, oh, yeah, the guy who was supposed to be here, he's actually was supposed to be staying in the fraternity house, so that's where you'll be staying. Oh, what fraternity house? Where is he? He told me, and I said, okay, can I leave my bag while I walk? He said, yeah. So I walked and found the fraternity house, knocked on the door. a guy came to the door and I said, "Hey, Lou, I'm the exchange student from Fisk. I've been told I'm supposed to stay here." Well, they were meeting to plan rush, who they were going to go after to try to get into the fraternity. So all the members were sitting in the living room. He said, "Hey guys, it's Lou Outlaw, the exchange student from Fisk University who's taking so-and-so's place." They all stood up, started applauding, and walked to the door and started shaking my hand and welcomed me into the fraternity house. That was my entree into that fraternity house. Now, while I was there, so Dartmouth was on a quarter system. The first quarter was over before Christmas. And coming back, I actually rode across the country with a bunch of guys from Dartmouth, but that's another story. But anyway, before that was over, one of the guys came to me and said, "Hey, Lou, you don't have to go back to Fisk. You can stay at Dartmouth. We've talked to the dean, and you'll get a scholarship." What? I said, "Okay." So I go talk to the dean. He says, "Oh, yes, sure. If you'd like to stay, we'll give you a scholarship." Now, that was in the fall of 1965. About 2 years ago, I got an email message that said, "Professor Outlaw, you may not remember me. You all called me Gus at the time. Blah, 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 blah. This is Angus King, Senator Angus King."
Name's familiar.
From Maine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he said, "You may remember I was one of the people who went to the dean about," and we called him Gus.
Mm-hmm.
Angus Gus. That was, and he was one who had gone to the dean, and he would just say, "Catching up, blah blah blah, Senator, now a senator in the U.S. In the U.S. Senate." And I just said, so I came back, and at the start of the second semester, I said, "Yeah, maybe I should transfer." I didn't really want to, but I was in the student union. The dean of students came in, and he was with another administrator who was over financial aid. I was on, so I knew both of them fairly well. So I said, "Dean, I need to talk to you." "Yes, Mr. Outlaw." I said, "I want to talk to you about transferring to Dartmouth." He immediately turned his back on me and walked out of the building. Didn't say another word. And I'm like, "Dean," and the other official said, "Lucius, he's not going to talk to you now. Here, you better go to his office." So I rushed out and followed him to his office over in the academic building. He escorted me in, closed the door, and we sat down and started talking. And what I remember is the conversation began something like this. "Mr. Outlaw, we have been watching you. We've been watching you. We have expectations for you." And he began to talk about the universe's expectations and investment in. I had no clue about any of this. And he finished and reached in his desk and gave me a form to fill out to withdraw from Fisk. The conversation was over. And I took the form and walked out and graduated from Fisk.
He was persuasive.
Yeah, I had no idea. Now, there were reasons why I didn't really want to go to Dartmouth, but I thought about it and,
Well, I could go on a whole tangent and ask you about your impressions of the Northeast and New Hampshire and a PWI in that different world. But
well, I ended up going to graduate school in Boston at Boston College because I had spent time while at Dartmouth down in Boston.
Okay.
At Harvard, Dartmouth games and seeing something about Boston. Knew lots of kids from Fisk were from Boston. And Boston became a kind of world like, wow, I kind of like this. So I got recruited to a graduate school, and so I went to Boston. That's where I met Frida. We've been married almost 56 years.
You met your wife in Boston College?
She was in the School of Nursing as a graduate student, starting my second year. Yeah.
And her name's Frida?
Frida, yeah. So the Northeast became, kind of a favorite place. But, by the time I was ready to get done, I wanted to be back in the Fisk and got recruited to come back to Fisk, and that's another interesting story. So I began my career teaching here. Yeah.
Well, okay, we'll get there momentarily. So just tell me a bit about, are you majoring in philosophy? Mm-hmm. When did you drop theology? Like, how did that academic transition take place as an undergrad? And what are you interested in learning and studying at that time?
Well, as I said, I had been doing this preaching thing, but it was I've been called to preach kind of thing. That's a whole kind of religious experience, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a long, complicated story about that. But I thought that was true for me, but I never liked it. So I come to Fisk, and I'm in these philosophy class. I take a course on existentialism, and it's about human freedom and blah, blah, blah. And I'm with a roommate who's intellectually very curious from Hot Springs, Arkansas. Interesting story about him. And we're lying in bed one night, and we're talking, and it's about this preaching thing. And I was like, man, I don't really like this. I don't want to do it. And he says, well, you don't have to do it. I'm like, yeah, but God called me. He's like, yeah, but you're free to make your own choices. I'm then saying, yeah, that's right. And I decided, I'm not doing this. And I literally just broke down and started crying. He got up and said, hey, it's going to be all right. And I had made my decision. This was like sophomore year, second semester, sophomore year. And I was like, I'm not doing this. And of course, then I wrote to my parents and told my mother. Now, part of the background is I said I was an only child. I was the seventh birth. None of the previous six had survived. And while I was like a preteen and early teen, my mother had another pregnancy with a set of twin girls, neither of whom survived. So I was the only one survived.
Oh, my goodness.
And so she had prayed to God when she was pregnant with me that if you give me a child, I'll give it back to you. So she made sure I was inside of every damn church she possibly could.
Wow.
So when I go through this, I've been called a priest thing, she was ecstatic. She was happy. Her deal with God had been made. So when I wrote to her and said I wasn't doing this anymore, she flipped out, of course. Why did I send you up to that place with ancient law? So I came home for a break. It was like in the middle of the week, she's in getting dressed to go out. Well, there's nothing happening in Starkville, especially by the time the sun goes down. My parents didn't drink. They didn't do nightclub. They didn't go, there wasn't no nightclub, but they didn't go out to beer joint, any of that stuff. So I'm like, where's she going? Nothing is happening at church. Then there was a knock on the door. It was the minister of our church. I was like, ah. So she's like, there he is. So she leaves, and the minister comes in. My dad's out cutting the grass, and I'm sitting there, and he walks in the door, and I said to myself, he's not going to win this argument. He's not going to win. So he stays, and we talk. I have no memory of whatever we talked about, none whatsoever. The only memory I have is, at a certain point, my mother comes back. He gets up and puts on his hat, gets ready to leave, and as he's going out the door, he says to my mother, there's nothing wrong with that boy, leave him alone. And I'm like, and of course, it led to some really torturous relationship between me and my mother. So finally, I said to her once, I said, look, you can't make deals with God over my life. I'm going to live my life on my time. I said, you can't pray me into heaven. If I get there, it's going to be on what I do. So I've decided I'm going to live my life on my terms. And I said, God and I have made a deal. He won't mess with me. I won't mess with him. And she just freaked out. Because this is a deeply religious woman, right? And she's gone through all this pain and given, promised God this stuff. And I'm like, no, you don't make deals with my life. And it took her, and for a year or so, I just avoided going home. And it took her a while to come around. We got married, had a baby, and then she worked at a nearby junior college. I was invited down to give a major keynote speech, and I did. We were in her apartment after, and she said, listening to you, I realize now there are a lot of different ways to minister. I said, yeah. And she would call sometimes and say, oh, it's Easter Sunday, you're going to church? I'm like, hell no. And I just, talk to Frida. I give her the phone, and she finally learned, just leave me alone about it. It was hard for her, but I had just said, then you're going to have to learn to live with this. Mm-hmm. Now, you can either learn to live with it, or you're going to be miserable all your life, because I'm going to live my life on my terms, period. And that's been it. As I said, God and I made a deal. We don't mess with each other. So that's how I live my life.
This is part 2 of our interview with Dr. Lucius T. Outlaw Jr. It is March 13th, 2025, about 2 o'clock Central Time. And we're recording this interview remotely. I'm in Houston, Texas. And Dr. Outlaw, I believe you're in Nashville, Tennessee.
That's right, at home.
Dr. Outlaw, do you consent to this interview taking place today?
I consent wholly and enthusiastically.
All right, so Welcome back to the conversation, Lou. I'm going to start here.
Okay.
When you were a student at Fisk, what civil rights activities or movement work do you remember taking place on Fisk campus during that time?
Oh, well, I, entered Fisk as a freshman in the fall of 1963, and the desegregation movement was still very much on the way. That is, uh, marching, picketing, sitting in at restaurants that had not desegregated earlier as downtown was still very much underway. And at the time, I think there was a focus on one uh, prominent cafeteria restaurant, and I'll try to remember the name, Morrison's, it was called. Um, and it was interesting because, I think pretty much most of the waiters, the wait staff were colored males, but they didn't want to serve uh, Negro patrons, and so they were a target. So when I came on board, my freshman year and et cetera, those demonstrations were still underway. Students were leaving, going participated, getting arrested, being bailed out, coming back, singing, songs or that were prominent in the movement. In some cases, literally showering and getting ready to go back out to picket and what have you. Yeah. So, and during my first year, Martin Luther King Jr. made another visit to the campus. I was reading uh, a memoir by a famous person, Reverend James Lawson. It's a book being co-written with him by another woman. So I'm reading some of the chapters, and he was recounting King coming to speak at Fisk in the gym, I think in the late 50s, early 60s. And I was like, oh, wow, that's interesting because he came again in 63, 64. When I was in, I went to hear him. So yeah, that movement was still underway, um, going quite strong at Fisk at the time.
Now, I know you involved yourself in a little bit of in student organizing, right? Wasn't there an issue or a campaign that you were involved in?
That came later. That actually came my junior year. And that had, I mean, I wasn't involved in the movement because my parents said don't do it, and I didn't have the strength to disobey them. But I made a vow that, okay, if I'm not going to be in the street, I will find a way to contribute to this movement. And I decided to become a college university teacher I wanted to be. And so teaching would become a way in which I thought I could contribute. In the fall of my junior year, I went on exchange from Fisk to Dartmouth College. And at that time, there was a lot of stuff happening at the Dartmouth campus, a lot of campus, particularly in opposition to the war in Vietnam. And so I was in that environment. And furthermore, the summer after my junior year, I participated in a program in Scandinavia where I was in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden for about 6, 7 weeks. And we went over to France on a ship that was chartered to carry students to Europe who were going to be doing Europe, travels in Europe over the summer. And it was a ship that had more than 3,000 students on it. And it was about a 7-day voyage from New York, and it stopped in England and then moved over to Le Havre, France, which is where my group got off, and we ended up flying from France to Copenhagen. But there was a lot of anti-war gatherings and discussions and seminars happening on that voyage. So by the time I was back at Fisk, I had gained a particular kind of sense about student protests and student power. So it was in the spring of my senior year, spring or fall, I forget which, there was an issue about something students wanted. It had to do with library hours and how late could women stay out, and a bunch of student life stuff that we wanted loosened up and a greater range of freedom for students. And so, and at Fisk, there was a well-established tradition of town hall meetings. where student government would call for a town hall, and as many as interested students would gather in the chapel where a town hall sort of participatory democratic discussion would take place. And that was pretty common. So there was a town hall, and at some point I got involved and stood up and said, look, really the key to how this university functions in many ways has to do with students. It's about us in certain ways. And if we refuse to participate in certain ways, then it can't function. So I think we should go on strike. In the room, he said, are you out of your mind? Like, yeah, it's student power. I'm for student power. And so, in fact, it got taken up. And the next day, there was a student strike where students refused to go to class and gathered out on the lawn near the administration building and protesting. And I don't know who was doing the shuttle diplomacy with the then acting president or whatever, but basically we won. And that was sort of the beginning of my career of activism and led to my subsequently being a key part of my campaign to be elected student government president, which I won that race. There was three of us competing and I won. So that was sort of when I got my real activism period as a student.
So when you won student to become president, what did that mean to you? What sorts of responsibilities and activities did that entail?
Well, for me, it meant that, my way of characterizing it was that any and all things that had to do with student life, students should have a fundamental say, if not complete responsibility for. Now, it wasn't that there wasn't any student responsibility. We were just trying to broaden and expand it and in certain kinds of ways, more substantive kind of ways, and to free up some of the impositions of in loco parentis that were prevailing at that time. So for me, the key was, if it has to do with student life, students ought to have a fundamental say in how do we manage our own life, and et cetera. One of my classmates, for example, led an initiative to establish an honor code for Fisk, an academic honor code that would allow students to take examinations without any proctoring. And it was an interesting campaign, and there was success to the campaign, but it was voluntary. So you had to sign a formal pledge that you would do this, but you would abide by the terms of the honor code. But you didn't have to do it. For example, I was on the faculty of Haverford College for 20 years, which has both an academic and a social honor code, where you can't matriculate at Haverford unless you agree to be bound by those two codes, both of which are administered by students. But if you don't want to do that, you can't be a student at Haverford. And so the code at Fisk was voluntary, and a certain number of students signed it. And so if you were in a class where an exam was being given, if you were a signatory to that code, you actually got to take your exam in a different room under different conditions or whatever, because your examinations were not going to be proctored. And so because you were bound by your honor not to cheat on exams. So it was a very interesting expansion of, student life at Fisk in that period.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that at the same time that students are demanding more of a voice and more power, Black power is becoming the call of the movement in 66 with Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael's enunciation during the Meredith March and moving into 67. So student power, Black power, gaining a voice. This is the backdrop for the formation of a lot of HBCU radio stations as well. So I know you're going to be going off to Boston College to pursue your graduate work in 67 or so. But how is that time and those shifting politics shaping who you are in that moment as a graduate student?
Oh, in very powerful ways. So yeah, I go off to Boston in fall of 67. And the opposition to the Vietnam War is intense. We've just gone through the sort of
rise of the articulation of the call for Black Power happens in 1966. That actually happens while I was in Scandinavia, and there were a bunch of us, four of us from Fisk, a bunch of other students, and we're there trying to figure out what the hell does this mean. And one of the students was a Black kid from Tougaloo College who was a member of SNCC. So he could articulate, and he was reading this book. He kept telling me, "You got to read this book, Lou, you got to read this book." And it was Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Well, I didn't read it till, several years later, but we're there trying to figure out, what does this mean? What does Black Power mean? What does Black Power mean? So by the time I got back to Fisk, then of course, that's a major intellectual, cultural influence. Young women are starting to wear their hair natural. We're trying to figure out, well, what does this mean? We're now trying to call ourselves Black rather than call it a Negro. What does that mean? And because it used to be, as a kid, if you want to wound another kid, you would call them Black because it was the derogatory characterization. Well, now we're supposed to accept it as a positive. So that was happening. So I had sort of lived through that on my last year at Fisk and shifted my own thinking about myself. Then I get to graduate school in Boston College, where Boston was a center of higher ed. There were supposedly something like 250,000 students within a 25-mile radius of downtown Boston. So it was a real hotbed of activism happening all around metropolitan Boston. And, when there was, major demonstrations around the country opposing the war in Vietnam, one of the largest of those demonstrations happened in the greater Boston, Cambridge area, so it was a very real hotbed of activity. I, for starting early in my second year of graduate school, I started sharing an apartment with a Fisk classmate who was at Harvard Law School. We graduated from Fisk together. He went to Harvard, I went to Boston College. So we got an apartment together in January, February of 1968. Now, in April, I'm at Boston College one evening in a seminar. It was a seminar for graduate students where faculty were helping us to prepare to be better teachers. And so it was a seminar where we were discussing and working out and talking about, pedagogical techniques and all kinds of stuff like that. And at a certain point, we said, okay, let's take a break. And so I was sitting in the room, and one of the graduate students, a woman who was a year or two ahead of me, but we had become good friends, came back into the room before we started again and said, "Hey, Lou, did you hear about Dr. King?" I said, "No, I didn't hear. What about Dr. King?" She said, "He's been killed." So what do you mean? And she said, "He was assassinated." And without any real deliberation, I simply got up, packed up all my stuff, and just walked out. I was the only Black person in my cohort in the Graduate School of Philosophy at that time. And I just got up and walked down the hill to the trolley stop. There was the Boston trolley had a stop at the base of the hill of the campus. Got on that trolley, took it back into town. I lived in an area called Back Bay over near the Prudential Building, and just went to my apartment. And all the time I was just in an enormous kind of turmoil because I didn't know how to process this at all. And so I left my apartment and went walking into a neighborhood that was, pretty heavily Black. And people were out on the sidewalks, on the street. People were crying. There were sirens going off. There was some running. And again, it was just a lot of confusion. Like, what the hell does this mean? Now, there had been another really marking experience in whenever it was, the fall of my freshman year, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. I mean, that was a major experience that led to, gatherings on the Fisk campus and the chapel, and young people crying, trying to figure out, what does this mean? How do we deal with it? Because there was a lot of admiration for John Kennedy among particularly young Black folk. If you move through a lot of Southern Black homes during those years, you would often see later on, you'd be at home, you would see three pictures on the wall, one of John F. Kennedy, one of Martin Luther King Jr., and one of Robert Kennedy, all of whom became president. So Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 68, and so these were really tremendously uproarious kinds of years. And so you got this anti-war stuff going on, huge demonstrations about that. You've got the second wave feminist movement underway. So in Boston, where you've got a lot of college students, a lot of young white women among them, that's the force that is coming onto campuses and shared political life. So, if you engage in any kind of political stuff, you're wrestling with all these issues: racial identification, sexual gender identification, political orientations. So it was a really turbulent, and in some ways, very fervent time. I mean, and so I went walking in the community trying to figure out what does this mean, how to deal with it. And there was one evening that kind of symbolized it all. So my roommate, as I said, who was in Harvard Law School, we had a 2-bedroom apartment. He had a back bedroom that looked out the window. We were literally a block across the street from the Prudential Building, which at the time was the tallest building in Boston. And I had a small bedroom on the front of the apartment. So he started yelling at me. He said, roommate, Raymond, come here, hurry up, hurry up. So I was reading a book by Sartre or something, preparing for a seminar. So I go running back there and I go, yeah, what's up, roommate? He's looking out the window. He says, let's go burn down the Prudential Building. And I said, roommate, the building is made out of concrete and steel. You can't burn it down. He said, that's not the point. Let's go burn down the Prudential Building. And I'm like, okay. My mother was maid work. My father's a janitor. I'm all supposedly getting a PhD, and I got to explain to them that I got arrested carrying matches and gasoline headed to a concrete steel building because I'm planning to burn it down. This doesn't make any damn sense. And he's like, I said, roommate, that doesn't make it. You can't burn down the Prudential Building. That's not the point. Let's go burn down the Pru. And this went on for 3. I'm like, roommate, what the hell's wrong with you? So he was from Hot Springs, Arkansas. We're very close friends, had been roommates for a year or two at Fisk. And so he finally sort of calmed down. And what was bothering him was he's at Harvard Law School. Professors in the law school are making it very clear. We're not interested in questions of social justice. You're here to learn to think like a lawyer. Brief the case. Tell us what the issues are. How does the law apply? That's it. Learn to think like a lawyer. We're not interested in questions of social justice. So here is a young Black kid from the South, from Fisk University at Harvard Law, and they're like, we're not interested in those issues. What about justice? We're not interested in it. Tell us what the law says. So he's just very, very frustrated. And I'm like, okay, I can understand the frustration, but trying to burn down the Prudential Building is not going to be the way I'm going to try to resolve that. And so I had to figure out other ways and got involved with the organization. But it was a really momentous time, and it sort of cemented, if I'm going to be a college teacher, which is my commitment, I'm getting a PhD as my kind of union card. Well, what am I going to do? Now, none of the courses I was studying had any text or anything in there regarding Black people, period. I never had a teacher who was Black, et cetera. So I had to both figure out how to do this work and do it well to get a PhD, et cetera, when I'm not dealing with anything that has to do with Black folk. And so where I have those interests, I have to pursue them on my own because I'm not pursuing them in courses. And that became what we used to call doing double duty. You got to do the work that's being required of you, like, what he's being required to do in Harvard Law School. But if you've got other commitments, for your life, et cetera, you got to pursue those. Those two things have got to be separate. So for me, it became a question, okay, doing this is the work I must do to get certified to go do what I want to do later on. And so it became that delayed, okay, what I want to do is I have to prepare for. I can't do it right now. I can be involved, but I'm not going to go try to make the revolution now. I got to prepare myself for being able to be hired to do the kind of teaching I want to do. And that means I can't give in to immediate concerns about I got to go save the world or burn down, you know, the madness right now. So it taught me a kind of discipline and have a longer view in how to prepare myself for a future and not become so frustrated about the immediacy of things that I need to go blow my chances for the future.
Yeah, I'm just curious on top of that, did like attending a PWI like BC and the way you're talking about having to kind of have these two tracks, these two curricular tracks, one more informal, one through the program. What did that tell you about the education provided at Fisk? Did it make you look differently at an HBCU like Fisk? Did it make you appreciate it in a new way?
Yeah, well, I mean, the way I put it was that I came to realize that there were ways in which at Fisk we had been cultivated to have, and I don't know, a certain kind of assurance, but a certain kind of arrogance, right? So, at BC, there was only one time I worried about whether or not I was going to do well academically. I had taken a course on Immanuel Kant with a professor who was regarded among graduate students as one of the most demanding professors in the department. And so I had this course, and then we had a final written examination. And I had done a lot of intensive studying for this exam. And I went and I took the exam and somehow came out of it. And I went over to the apartment of this woman I was seeing, who's my wife now, almost 56 years later. I went to her apartment and I said, I need a drink. She said, what's that? I said, I just took this exam and this seminar. And I think I failed the exam. This is my first failure I've ever had in the whole time I've ever been in school. And proceeded to get hair smashed. And then we went back to my apartment. Well, the next week I go and I go to that seminar and the professor is passing back the examination booklets, right? And he gives me mine and says something to me that sort of mumbles like, wow, Mr. Outlaw, kind of surprised and whatever. And the upshot of it was I had the highest score of all the participants in the seminar. And that was something like an A in the seminar. It's like, okay, wow. But otherwise, I learned when I got there were other students who, for example, knew more book titles than I did. In some ways, they had read wider than I had. So some of them had already had master's degrees in philosophy, or they had had a lot more courses than I had had. But I knew how to study. I had studied really, really hard at Fisk, and I knew how to work. And so I just worked hard as in the ways in which I had learned to do. And as I said, except for that one class, I never doubted that I could succeed. And again, Boston College became a place that I was passing through. Now, my third or fourth year, I was offered a position on the faculty. Now, this was a relatively new PhD program. They were intent upon not inbreeding. They want their graduates to go out and establish reputations to help build the statue of the department by way of who gets hired to do X, Y, and Z. And I was the only graduate student, I think, that they ever, up to that point, ever asked to stay, because they said, look, we want you to stay and help us develop a program in social and political philosophy, which is what my interests were. Those were the things I was focused on. And I was doing independent study with professors and reading stuff that no professor was teaching. Actually, the professor that became the director of my dissertation, I did reading courses with him, but that is, I would go decide, here's a bunch of stuff I want to read. Would you sort of supervise this? And if I write an essay, you read and approve it. And yeah, okay, I'll direct your reading course. But I built my own reading list. I didn't get my reading list from him. And later on, he became those readings became a focus of his teaching once I was out of the graduate school. He began to move into those areas and take them up his teaching. And, they asked me to stay, but at the time I had been invited back to Fisk and had an offer to go to Fisk, and was like, wasn't it wasn't an option I was going to take, in part because I didn't want to stay at Boston College and sort of be in a sort of continuing junior subservient role to people who had been my professors, whereas I could go back to Fisk, which was a kind of home base for me in terms of my own intellectual coming of age. And I wanted to, again, to contribute to the movement. So I wanted to go back south and be a part of what was happening in the South and do it by way of Fisk. So I declined the offer to stay at Boston College.
Yeah, along those lines. So when you do get back to Fisk, I think it's around 1972 or so.
1970.
Oh, 1970. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Got the wrong data on mine. Um, how had the university changed when you returned? Right, because you had to finish your PhD. How had the university changed upon your return at that point, at the height of the Black Power movement? Did it feel different in any way since when you left?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways I was surprised by the extent to which, for example, the impact of the whole Black consciousness, Black Power movement had impacted student cultural life and the institution. So, I left in '67. I was back on campus in '70. Was awarded my degree in '72. That may be where you got the '72 from. But when I got back, it was clear that those forces of consciousness raising, heightening of political consciousness, and all of that around notions of, Black cultural nationalism, Black culture, and all that, had really had an impact on the student body and how they would express themselves. And I guess one of the ways in which I first noticed it and was both surprised and impressed was the way in which it had begun to show up among some of the people in fraternities, for example. My last year, I had become somewhat disenchanted with the fraternity I was in because, it was still about, oh, let's go party, chasing girls, having sex, doing that. And I was like, hey, guys, we need to be doing something more socially substantive. And one of the guys said, man, you need to understand this is a social organization. I'm like, oh, okay, fine. Y'all go spend your time doing that. I'll do something else. And so I was an officer in it, but I began to just pull back my time and energy with that and just saying, yeah, that's not how I'm going to spend my time. And after that, from graduate school, only for a little while when I was at Harvard, I really have not been active in that fraternity, which is an international organization that still has prominence and all that, but I don't tend to be involved with it, et cetera. But it was clear, and there had been, protests by students who had tried to demand that Fisk become a Black university and not a colored or Negro one. And that had led to some high tensions and a fire and a commission for a Black university. And the university had to figure out how to both accommodate and to some extent co-opt those demands and concede some things, but not all things, like get rid of all white faculty and all white members of the board of trustees. No, we're not doing that. Don't accept any money from white, donors. No, we're not doing that. So there was some, finessing of it all and figure out how to keep it going. And I had also learned to make a distinction during those turbulent years, when there were people were saying, well, the way we got to deal with universities, we got to destroy them to make them over again. And my notion was, nah, I'm not going with that one. I think there are transformations that can be made without destruction. And, later on, I would learn there was a big issue in the communist movement, between people like Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and Edward Bernstein, who was like, okay, you call it for revolution. We think there's a way to get there through reform. And here's how we can do it through democratic policies. And, Lenin and them were like, nah, we're going to kill you all if you take that. But there's only one way, it's through violent revolution. China was the same thing with Mao, Cuba. And I was not convinced of that. So I opted for other paths and figured out how can you be radical without being destructive? How can you renovate things without having to destroy? And, this was heightened in the Vietnam War when there was a major war, major episode in the war where there was a destruction of one of the ancient cities called Hue, Q-U-E. And, the America bombed devastated the city and its ancient temples and structures, all kinds of stuff. And a reporter once confronted one of the generals about who was overseeing all of this, about all the destruction that was going on in this ancient city and all of its historic buildings and the life and all kinds of stuff. And he said, yeah, we had to destroy the city in order to save it. And it was that kind of sense that when that's also on the table for consideration, it was like, no, that doesn't make any sense to me. No, I'm not committed to the only way we got to destroy these institutions to rebuild them. Like, no.
Well,
Nope.
given that these different tracks here, revolutionary versus reformist, how is these articulations translate into radio and to the eventual student-led formation of what becomes Radio Free Nashville? What are you observing? What is the relationship between student-led Black radio and the movements?
Well, I mean, in some sense, it's hard for me to say because the students who became involved with the radio station, I knew, but I don't think I actually had any of them in class. Now, I go back to Fisk, so a lot of the texts that I'm having students read are texts that are explicitly talking about revolution. Students are reading Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. There are other texts. I got to know this couple called James and Grace Boggs, who did this book called Revolution and Evolution in the 20th Century. Well, by the mid-70s, I'm having them at Fisk as speakers, and they are having a conversation with me and they are explicitly committed revolutionaries. They have been members of a faction of the Communist Party that had broken away from the Stalinist Communist Party. They were another group, and they called themselves the Johnson Forest faction. They were a breakaway. They were Trotskyites. And remember, Trotsky was interesting because Trotsky helped to recruit a group of Black nationalists from New York to go to the Soviet Union for training. But they were nationalists, the Revolutionary Black Brotherhood. And so there was a real issue with the Communist Party. At one point, they had to deal with the question of national distinctions. So for a minute, they said, okay, the Negro in the United States must be regarded as a suppressed national minority. And so we need to have a kind of two-track strategy. Yeah, we need to revolutionize the United States of America, but you must recognize that there's this distinct population there that needs to have its own rights and would have a recognize. That lasted for a bit. I mean, most of the American left, white folk in particular, mostly never went with that. It was white racism that was supposed to predominate, et cetera. So, and then I was reading, a friend of mine had given me a copy of, told me about Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Well, here it is coming out of revolutionary work in Latin America, but of a different kind. It's not Soviet revolution. It's not the Leninist violence. It's not the destroy. It's about how you educate people for revolutionary change. But that revolution is not about destruction. It's about reconstructing, rebuilding, and et cetera. It's not about going and killing and destroying people. It's about how do you get people into a mindset where they can understand how important freedom is, if to a certain conception of their own humanity, and how they can then become prepared to do the living work of remaking societies in important kinds of ways. And it was not about. And so this is this kind of stuff that I started teaching. While in graduate school, I had gone to a lecture at Boston College to hear this man that was very influential. I didn't know about him. A classmate had said, let's go down to this lecture. I go, I listen, I'm really impressed. I started, has he written anything? I started reading him. It was Herbert Marcuse, who was a major professor of Angela Davis out at Brandeis. I mean, I didn't know this at the time. So I started reading Marcuse and finding out, well, he's part of a larger cohort of people, the Frankfurt School. So I started reading the Frankfurt School. So when I'm at Fisk in the 70s, I'm teaching Frankfurt School. And a focus of my teaching is about the cultivation of critical thinking, social political life, et cetera. And I would learn, for example, I had a number of young people majoring in philosophy who were close to me. They were reading all this stuff. And one of the byproducts of that for the young women was that they would end up having difficult times getting dates because a guy would come and want to, hit on them and talk to them. And they'd say something like, well, what are you reading? He's like, what? And they start talking about the stuff they're reading, and their discourse was filled with these terms that they were getting from the stuff they was reading. And of course, one of the things that they would be raising was, how do you think critically about X, Y, and Z? And they're like, oh, you're one of Outlaw's people. I don't have time. Yeah, because they're like, oh, all you want me to do is take my clothes off? No, let's talk. What are you reading? And it was like, oh, I can't be. So that was, and there was a lot of that happening by way of a lot of young fellows. I mean, one of the interesting things about Fisk was how many young faculty there were on that in the university in the 70s. There were a significant number, and who all were about how do we cultivate these young people to be critically minded, responsible, but also academically really capable people to go out into the world.
Yeah, so your students who are learning critical theory and political philosophy, and are any of them moving into the radio medium? Are any of them using this new station to communicate ideas?
Yeah, I mean, there are students who are coming past me, both in my philosophy class, and then I was director of the honors program, who are in the honors program. And the honors program has got seminars, we've got speaker programs, we've got film programs. For example, the film program was we would bring and show films on campus that were not available commercially. They were not commercial theater film. And so we would bring films in from around the world. And so there was and that was typical of the honors program. So there was this whole cultural scene that students were imbibing, even if they were not in the honors, because all of those activities were open to any and all students. You could only take the seminars if you had been vetted into the honors program by virtue of academic stuff and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of stuff happening in the honors center, students would come to, even if they were not honors students. They would be welcome to the lectures and talks and all kinds of stuff and the films and that kind of stuff. So a number of the students who were intimately involved with the establishment of the radio station had been students in my classes. Now, the young men who were leading it, Bobby Bass and his brother, Bobby had not taken a course with me, but a number of the other people I was talking to recently, to a woman who is a Fisk alum. She graduated with the Vanderbilt Law School, married a guy who's a good friend. They live in Nashville. She had been with a prominent law firm, but we were talking recently, and she somehow how the radio station came up. She said, yeah, I was one of the first interns they hired in the radio station. Well, she was one of my students as an honor student. And she likes to tell the joke about how there was a period, several of the years I was at Fisk, I drove a Porsche. And the first one I had was a Target where you could take the top off and it'd be like a convertible. And I had driven up on campus and parked in front of the student union. I was off in some building doing whatever. And she revealed later that she and a girlfriend came by and said, let's sit in Professor Outlaw's car. So they climbed in and sat in my car out in front of all these students while I was off in some building doing whatever. But she was she said she was the first intern. There was another young woman who had been in my class in my intro to philosophy. We had a very close relationship. She became one of the disc jockeys. And I think if I listen to that tape, I think I may have started that recording when she was on the air, or at some point I did, because I would make a point of listening to when she was on, to what she was playing, et cetera. So there was a kind of indirectness to my involvement with the students, but it was very much in keeping with my sense of, hey, give students as much running room as you can, and then support them to do things. And that was happening with the honors program and with the regular students. So it was very in keeping with a sense of what Fisk was at its best.
Yeah, why do you, in your view, think it was important that Fisk students had a voice on the radio? What and compare that to the rest of the radio scene in Nashville at that time.
Well, I mean, Fisk was its own unique institution within the context of Nashville because it is a private institution, which was really key during that civil rights period because there were ways in which administrative power of the city and state could not leverage Fisk because Fisk was not dependent upon the city or the state for revenue or for anything like that. It was a private enclave. It had an interracial faculty. It had a racially integrated student body because there were white students coming into Fisk all the time as exchange students from predominantly white institutions. And there were a couple of white students who were regular students at Fisk, who chose to go to Fisk. So it was this little oasis. And again, it was a place that cultivated. And so you had faculty members, right? So you got a bunch of faculty with advanced terminal degrees, a long history of people leaving Fisk and going and beginning to establish reputations out in the world, Du Bois, et cetera. Just so Fisk is this interesting place on top of this hill in North Nashville that has a kind of cachet, and as I said, had a kind of sense of itself you might call confident and even arrogant to some sense. And so it could be a place where people could do things. I'll give you one example. So my freshman year, there was an issue that came up, and it had to do with a Harvard professor had written a book about higher education. He had surveyed colleges and universities throughout the country, and part of the book was about Negro colleges and universities. And at some point in the book, he described places like Fisk as middle-class winter resorts. They were not serious institutions. Well, somehow some, upper-class students, bright, reading, had gotten a hold of this book and were infuriated and insulted by this. I mean, this led literally to a town hall where this book is discussed, and people are literally threatening to have book burnings in the middle of campus and to write this man and like, how dare you speak of Fisk in this way? I mean, it was that kind of attitude that was being nurtured at Fisk. And as I said, people going off to, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, you name it, into the federal government, in a company like IBM, there were all kinds of ways in which you understood Fisk was a launching pad into places that otherwise Negroes might not be going. And it wasn't that we were doing that because as some kind of gift or concession to us. It was like, no, this is what we deserve. We are capable. And so it was one of those breeding grounds for a certain kind of Black, if you will, talented tent that had a certain kind of confidence about ourselves, but also about a mission to be about something in the country, in the world, on behalf of Black people.
And then on radio, is there anything significant we should recall from that time in the mid 70s? Programming, music, what did you hear?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think if you were to get ahead, I mean, again, I think I gave Sharon the recording that I made of several hours, and I don't remember what programs. I just put the tape on and let it run, and it was a reversible recording tape machine. So if I put on the longest possible reel tape, and I had wound it down and put in a piece of foil at the end, when it got to that foil, it would then reverse and keep going. So it could record at the slowest speed something like about 6 hours. And so I just set it up and let it run and record it. But yeah, I mean, so here you've got a radio station on a campus where you've already got, in terms of programming and curricula, et cetera, the exploration of kinds of interesting, challenging, radical, even revolutionary ideas. I mean, in Ellsworth, we had a seminar once team taught by me and another professor that we're reading a particular text by Marx and Engels, right? I mean, so and there's no threat or challenge to us with it. I mean, this is, as I said, I'm teaching Frankfurt schools now, reading Marx and, the Communist Manifesto. I mean, and there was no fear that there's a retribution from doing that. So it is this kind of place. And so the radio station is just continuing that kind of openness and exploration with a kind of attitude. So both in the music and program, who comes to speak, et cetera, et cetera. So all across the political spectrum, you've got people coming in. So in the honors program, we had, when I started, I had a $10,000 budget. A year or so later, I had a $110,000 budget. We had $100,000 from the Rockefeller Foundation. And so I poured a lot of that money into the speakers. So each summer, I would hire students to work as interns. We'd write to all the departments and programs and say, hey, who would you like to have as a speaker during the next academic year? Send us the names, and we will invite them. We will pay all their expenses, but you'll get first billing in the publicity regarding it, but we'll underwrite it. And, we had Jesse Jackson. I sometimes quietly say, Jesse Jackson decided to run for president, was spurred by when he came to Fisk. So he came, when we get that list built, so one of the things we would do is, once we got a confirmation, we would schedule it and we would build our list of speakers and their schedules in the summer. So in the fall, we'd have all of our speakers booked, listed for the whole academic year. We would then distribute it throughout the campus, but we sent that list to every television and radio station and newspaper in the city, so they would know who was coming. So, and typically, I mean, we'd have people like Jesse Jackson, Shirley Chisholm, you name it. And I mean, I invited Strom Thurmond, Marcuse. Strom couldn't come. Ted Kennedy could come. Yeah.
Now, would you ever broadcast any of these talks or debates on the radio?
Well, so one of the things we did in the program was I bought equipment, right? So, for example, we had a tape recorder. So all of these speakers were taped. Now, the library, under the direction of Jesse Kearney Smith, Jesse had gotten major funding from, I think, the National Endowment for the Humanities, for example. So Jesse had a major oral history project. So she was in, so every speaker we brought to campus, the library would assign one of the staff persons to do an interview. So we built into their schedule sit down time in the library for an oral interview for the oral history project at Fisk. So that's being taped. All of the speeches of people who were speaking were routinely taped by the program. And so, yeah, those then could be made available, and I suspect, I don't remember, for the radio station, or people would be asked to come over to the station, to talk or be interviewed, et cetera. So there was a lot of cross feedback happening all the time.
Do you remember a mix of sort of public affairs and commentary with music? Was it a mix of content?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And remember, I mean, and the musical stuff is across all the genres.
Yeah, what did you
Not
hear?
all. Well, I mean, so in Nashville, you had WVOL, which is the black radio station. So they're playing the typical, R&B, soul, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that wasn't what was happening over in the WRFK. So, for example, the person who tended to be the staff person from the library who conducted the oral interviews with all of the speakers that we brought through, that was his principal job. He was also a jazz aficionado. So he had a collection in his home of hundreds of jazz albums. Well, that was one of my passions. So we'd get together. And so, as I had done when I was a kid, he and I, and you only do this with special people who know how to care for an album. You don't just let anybody put their hands on your albums or put them on a turntable? How do you handle a turntable? How do you handle a needle to preserve the needles? Because, you're trying to invest in top quality needles and turntable. You don't want to ruin the needle. So not everybody knows to do that. You take an album, you got to make sure you handle it by the edge and by the spindle hole and no fingerprints. Clean it carefully, how you rub it. Then you put it down and dust the needle and all. Well, this guy had hundreds of albums. And we would sometimes, hey, can I borrow it? Sure. Or I'd go to his house for listening. He'd come to my house for listening. Well, he had a show on the radio where he's playing jazz music out of his enormous collection and his enormous knowledge of all this. This is also a moment when free jazz is a thing. And so you got people playing in the union. I'm like, hey, if I can't pat my foot to it, I'm sorry, it don't work for me. What the hell is it? That just sounds like a bunch of noise. But all of this is being aired because, again, you've got the local Black radio station doing all the popular stuff, but they're not doing jazz. They're not doing the same kind of political stuff because they're a commercial and they got to get ads and all this. Well, who's going to support them with ad money if they're doing something controversial? Well, the Fisk radio station didn't have that problem. Fisk had a long reputation for bringing in all kinds of people that otherwise couldn't be aired in the city. So we were free. And you notice, what were the call letters for that radio station?
Yeah, Radio Free Nashville, WRFN.
Radio Free Nashville. And when you think of those call letters, you've got to be thinking about the independence movement on the continent of Africa.
Say more about that.
Well, I mean, the whole Black conscious thing, if you look at the influences, there's Malcolm X, but there's also Frantz Fanon. I mean, at that time period, if you thought of yourself in any way as kind of, revolutionary, radical, or whatever, you damn well had better have read Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, and you damn well had better have seen the movie on what did just go out of my head, about the French colony, Battle of Algiers. So you better have known something about the revolution in Cuba, because you also had Black folk who were hijacking planes and going to Cuba, right? One of whom was a young woman who was a good friend from Fisk, who was one of the hijackers, etc. So the anti-colonial movement in the South is alive and well in the imaginations of a lot of people at Fisk, and that whole spirit of decolonization, liberation, freedom, those are driving forces in the Black consciousness, Black power movement, period. And that whole artistic flowering around this, looking back to Africa, etc. One of the most influential professors at the time was a Nigerian professor of anthropology, Chike Onwuachi. So those influences and relationships are part of the shaping of the cultural and intellectual mindset prevailing at Fisk University at the time. And so, yeah, the radio station is Radio Free. Yeah.
It's playing an integral role in connecting people around this time, around Black power and Black consciousness.
Yeah.
And okay, so I do want to respect your time here. Moving on, you do go to Morgan State, and correct me if I'm wrong, around 1977?
I started in January of 1977, yeah.
Which is also, right, the same time that their radio station goes on air, WEAA, We Educate African Americans. So, contrast what you're hearing when you get to Morgan State in Baltimore and WEAA with the radio station at Fisk, WRFN. What are some of the differences between these two HBCU radio stations?
Well, I mean, you're dealing with different institutional contexts. So Morgan is a state institution. I got there and I discovered, I had met the former president of Morgan who had retired. I was on a postdoc the year before I went to Morgan. So I spent all of 76 on a postdoc in Philadelphia in a special news center for providing postdoc reprieve time for faculty from HBCUs. Well, one of the consultants, senior fellows to that, was a man who had been for years, the president of Morgan State University. And I'll remember his name in a moment. And so I got to know him there. And, as chance would have it, I didn't go to Morgan the very next year. So I knew him personally. Then when I got there and I was working at Morgan, I began to see and learn of his impact as a president. It was quite phenomenal. So Morgan was a state institution, but it had also had been shaped to be a place at which there was a lot happening in terms of cultivating the intellectual development of Black students at Morgan and high standing people there. I mean, one of the people there was a professor emeritus who had an office in the same building where mine was, and I got to know him. I knew of him, met him, and spent time talking with him, asking him to look at some of my writing. His name was Benjamin Quarles. So Benjamin Quarles is a historian who done a book on Frederick Douglass. He was a quite prominent historian and intellectual, and there were a number of people like that at Morgan State that I came to appreciate. Now, a new president had just come on board. Morgan was going through some changes, and I quickly learned that Morgan wasn't quite the place for me because what had happened was Martin Jenkins was that prior president, and it helped to cultivate a high regard for academic achievement and stuff at Morgan. Well, now there was someone else. The state had decided that, okay, each of the state institutions has to have a distinctive mission. Well, Morgan, one of the things that those in the philosophy department had proposed, let's do a PhD program in philosophy. It would be the first ever in the history of the country of a PhD program in philosophy at an HBCU in the United States of America. Well, that really wasn't going to fly because there was already a PhD program in philosophy at Johns Hopkins, though it's private, but state looks favorable on Johns Hopkins. There was a PhD program in philosophy at the University of Maryland down at College Park. So when the Commission on Higher Education for the state worked out this scheme where, okay, each institution must have a distinctive mission. And to the greatest extent possible, there can't be any overlap in the missions. Okay, so what is Morgan's mission going to be? So Morgan's mission got defined and set for Morgan as its focus will be on urban education, the education of urban population. Well, what the hell did that mean? And what about having a PhD program in philosophy? That doesn't meet an urban agenda. And besides, there's already a program at Hopkins, there's already a program at College Park. You can't duplicate. So no, you can't do that. And I discovered that Morgan was, in my judgment, in many ways, a colony of the state. So, for example, I went there in part as director of the honors program. So if I invited you to speak, I had to prepare a set of documents that I had to fill out a whole bunch of pieces of paper, and I had to complete those, sign them. I had to take them to my dean, who had to review them, make sure I had the budgeted funds for that. The dean had to approve it. It then had to go from the dean to the provost, who had to approve it. It had to go then to the president, who had to approve it. And then it was sent down to the central accounting office for higher ed down in Annapolis, Maryland, where they had to review it and make sure all the I's were dotted, T's crossed, and the proper signatures, and send it back. And it would work its way back to me and said, okay, you approve, you can invite Will to come speak. Now, I had to do all of that 6 weeks, at least 6 weeks prior to when you were supposed to appear on campus. All right, you come to campus, you appear, you do your presentation. I have to get a new piece of paper that says, on this date at this time, Will has spoken at Morgan. I have to give it to you. You have to sign and indicate, yep, I've been here on this date at this time, and I've completed the speaking engagement. I have to take that piece of paper, put it with that first batch that has gone through and gotten all these signatures and come back approved. I have to now put it with that and send it back through all of those offices again for review and signature, and go back to Annapolis where Annapolis would prepare your honorarium check and send it to you. It couldn't be done at Morgan. Now at Fisk, I've got a speakers program. As I said, we prepare our list of speakers in August. Once I got confirmation from you in August that you were going to come to speak at Fisk in March, I would request your honorarium check. And it would be prepared and be given to me a week or two later. So I would have your check locked in a drawer that only I had a key to in my secretary. We would have your honorarium check in August. You're not coming to the next year. Whereas at Morgan, that was a 12-week process that had to go through. And it would be 6 weeks before you get a check. And I'd have people calling me, man, when am I going to get my money? And I'm like, man, look, I was like, this is a colonial situation. Morgan couldn't write a check for his own speakers. And I'm like, I was like, okay. Then there were a whole bunch of other stuff. I mean,
No, that does sound frustrating.
yeah,
I understand the state systems. It's difficult to
yeah.
navigate. So
I just said, okay, not for me.
what do you recall about WEAA? Do you remember that radio station at all? Does it stick
Oh
out?
yeah. So, oh sure. Now remember that the person who was the manager of that station had his own prominent standing because he's this young guy, clearly deeply influenced by the Black Power, Black Conscious, whatever movement, because his name is Kwesi Mfume. Kwesi Mfume, right?
Now a
And
Congress.
so, right. And so that comes later, but he's the manager of the radio station for years. So that programming, we educate African Americans. I mean, he's drawing off the Morgan tradition. He's drawing off of people with, you know, less conventional, even radical, whatever ideas and teaching who have got programs on that station. But also, I think I mentioned to you, there was one member of the Morgan faculty who I think was in the music department. He had a Sunday morning program, and the title of which I'm not mistaken was called Sonorities in Black Music. And it was where he, as an ethnomusicologist, had extraordinarily expansive, deeply grounded knowledge of the musical development and contributions of African Americans. And I would listen to that religiously every Sunday morning. I didn't go to church, but I would listen to that program the way some people would go to church. I had to listen to his program. And that's where, for example, I would learn about Black classical composers because he was naming them and he's playing their music, or he's playing, who was it? Was it Stravinsky? One of the major European classical composers who wrote a symphony about African Americans. He's playing this on a Sunday morning. I learned about this. I'm like, holy crap. And so I listened to him religiously every Sunday morning. One of my colleagues in philosophy had a radio program. He counted himself a radical communist, social and political philosophy. He had a degree in philosophy from Boston University, which is how we met when we were both in graduate school. So he had a program on that radio station every Saturday night that had a wide audience. And just, all that programming was, really, really heavy. And I suspect it may have been by way of that radio station. I may be wrong, that I met, but certainly when I was at Morgan, one of the people I met was a guy roughly my same age who had started a publishing company. His name is Paul Coates, who has a very now prominent writerly son, Ta-Nehisi Coates. And so those people, those voices are being aired and heard, and the music, the voices, the programming, and stuff involving the university. But also Baltimore is a long historic place of politically involved Black families, the Mitchell family, a Black newspaper, the Baltimore African American, that runs back into the 19th century. So And there was a whole very powerful group of Black males who was called the Goon Squad. Well, they were the key organizing group around uh, Congressman Perrin Mitchell. They made sure Perrin got elected and reelected and reelected. And anything happening in the city of Baltimore involving Black politics, these guys would have a hand in it and have a say about it. I mean, they were really enormously influential, and they were all associated with Morgan. Right. So, you had a young guy who was head of the political science department, very involved throughout, the state and in the county where he lived in politics. So, there was a lot of influence being worked out of that university into city and state politics and stuff. And yeah, Kwesi and Fume. Kwesi goes on when Perrin Mitchell stepped down from serving as congressman. It was Kwesi and Fume who ran for and was elected into the seat that Perrin Mitchell had before. And I think Kwesi may have also been, and you can check me on this, I think Kwesi was head of the NAACP in Baltimore. Either before or after. At some point, he was head of the NAACP in Baltimore.
But in a sense, right, we have to understand his development of a political voice really being cultivated on radio, on Black radio, right?
Well, I'm not sure about the cultivation, but certainly was a means by which it got expressed. Because I said, if you think of his name, the development of a certain kind of political mindset and the way in which that radio station programming and its imaging is already being structured and expressed through those call letters, he's already formed in a way in order to do it. So it doesn't happen because of the radio station. I'm saying
Right.
he's already there. The radio station becomes a medium through which this is being played out.
Facilitator.
Yeah.
Now, I want to verify this with you. For sonorities in Black music, is that Dr. Dominique Renee de Lerma?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. Just, man, was he learning. Oh.
Can I take a few more minutes of your time here? I'm sorry.
Sure.
So thinking about, you mentioned Paul Coates and, known also for his Black publishing imprint, right? Locally in Baltimore. I think it's Black Classics maybe, but
yeah, that's right.
But how should we think about Black radio and HBCU radio as part of this cultural ecosystem that is flowering in the 1970s?
Well, the way in which you should begin to think about the resourcefulness of various media in general. I mean, there's a long history of the utilization of media for expression in behalf of the liberation, the freedom, the integrity of Black folk. I mean, from pamphleteers, the whole oral public speaking thing, of which I think there's no one as gifted and accomplished at that as Frederick Douglass, right? Who also starts with Martin Delany, the North Star, a newspaper, right? So you've got people who all along the way understood the importance of giving expression to and sharing, and not only expressing, but cultivating modes of understanding to influence how people led their lives, conducted their lives. But there's also another interesting part of that tradition that I find fascinating. Douglass is exemplary of this. And what I mean is, you would often find Douglass speaking to an audience, particularly of white people, and characterizing them in ways that they were not. And what I mean by that is, imagine someone who says, he's speaking to an audience of white folk where he knows many of the white people are hostile to him. He's a Black speaker. And he's speaking to them, he says, now you good people, blah, 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 and you good people, blah, blah, blah. Well, they may be some of the most hostile, racist people in the world, but why is he calling them good people? Is it that he's confused about it? No, it's what I call a kind of rhetorical manipulation. That is, you speak about them in ways that they are not, but now they are positioned in a way where they either have to affirm that they are good or show that they are not good. But now, because he's in a sense given you a characterization which you can take up, but if you take it up, you got to live out the implications of being good, which means you got to start treating him in a certain kind of way. But if you're not ready to do that, then that's going to become apparent. And then there's also the question, well, how are you going to live with that struggle, right? Another example for me is David Walker's appeal. So David Walker's writes an appeal to the colored citizens, particularly who are in the slaveholding states. Well, this is an interesting strategy, right? You're writing a pamphlet in which you're laying out all these declarations of what is supposed to be the case on behalf of the freedom of Negroes and condemning white races, blah, 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 blah. And you address it to all of the enslaved people in the slaveholding states, very few of whom could read. So was he misguided? No, he's not misguided. He's ostensibly writing to the slave, but that's not really his audience. Or another example is Martin Luther King.
Capacity.
Yeah, Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail. Right. So there had been something like, I think, 6 or 7 clergymen in Birmingham who had published an open letter in the Birmingham newspaper condemning the outside agitators coming to that city, blah, blah, doing blah, blah, blah. So while in jail, Martin King writes a response, right? The letter from Birmingham jail, which was smuggled out and published. Now, that letter was addressed to those clergymen. Now, according to a historian at the University of Alabama who wrote a book about that letter, not a single one of those clergymen ever received a copy of that letter. Right? King and the folks in SCLC had already learned of the power of various media, print, radio, TV, to dramatize things and bring it to the attention that would affect people, their sensibilities, and hopefully awaken their moral consciousness. That letter went over the heads of those clergymen. It was addressed to them, but they never delivered it to them. They didn't even send it to them. They sent it directly to the paper. Right? So my point is, there's this across the whole history of the President of Black Book, and getting literate was always a key strategy. And as they began to get literate, to use various means of literate expression to try and advance the cause of freedom and liberation and well-being and et cetera for Black folk. And so radio, look, why does James Brown, as he begins to accumulate capital, why does he buy radio stations? Not just because his music is getting played, but if you got now own the station, then you've got a means of communicating that is enormously powerful, right? Yeah.
You're. I was going to ask you. You're kind of answering that. I was going to ask you in a more complex question here. If you had to, as a political philosopher, describe a political philosophy of HBCU radio, how we might understand it, the nature of its power, what would that be? And I think you kind of just asked, but is there anything else that comes to mind when we think about the nature of the power of Black radio?
Well, I mean, again, it is to further cultivate audiences. Now, we've already got audiences, right? So think of churches. So Black churches already have audiences. Now, I may have mentioned to you, in my hometown of Mississippi, on a Sunday morning, in this segregated Mississippi town, on a Sunday morning, before church services were being broadcast starting around 11, there was a bunch of programming happening from about 7 or 8 until about 11. And in those Sunday morning time slots, there were always slots devoted to Negroes. So, for example, there was always a time slot in the mornings on Sunday where Black men who formed quartets and sang, gospel and church music were on the radio every Sunday morning. There was other programming that would bring Negroes into that on a Sunday morning. So there are already audiences. There were reading audiences. My father, the janitor on Saturdays, would always, once he finished work, go down to the colored section of town and hang out and visit with some friends and buy some roasted peanuts and come home with the peanuts and a copy of the Chicago Defender. So he read the paper religiously every week. So audiences. And so radio becomes another means of taking up those audiences and expanding them in ways that, you can overcome physical distance in certain ways because you're using radio waves. And radio is a big thing. I mean, I grew up listening to, my mother grew up listening to the soap operas that we see on TV. They were on radio first. I grew up listening to things like, there were suspense, stories. So radios had serials the way we see streaming series now, series 1, episode 1, 2, 3. Well, that stuff was happening over radio. I used to listen to a detective series. There were kids series. And so there were all kinds of audiences being created, subsidized by the advertiser of various companies, et cetera, et cetera. One of my favorite detective shows that I listened to on radio was sponsored by the Hartford Insurance Company, Hartford, Connecticut. So I had this image of Hartford. I'd never been there. But these media, when Black folk begin to take them up, are figuring out how to harness those audiences. Well, how do you harness an audience that's already, an audience, say, in a religious setting, is you use the music. You have the ministers come on. Ministers have radio programs, and you have call-in prayer services. Who can I pray for today? This is Sister so-and-so, Reverend. Could you say a prayer for? So the same thing that is happening in the church and begins to happen over radio, telephones, etc. Yeah.
So when HBCU radio stations in the 70s are serializing sort of Black history moments, right, and educating the community on Black history in contravance to the traditional histories being taught in a lot of
That's right.
schools. What does that mean, right? What does that mean for the community?
Well, I mean, what you got is an expansion of the consciousness raising and the critical consciousness formation that is already underway. And you've got a much wider expanse because not everybody is going to be in a college or university. It's expanding, but still there are generations who never had a chance to go. But, as Ralph Ellison says, through phonograph records, radio, et cetera, more people learn than that would learn inside of a college or university, right? Because you're bringing the curricular stuff into this new medium format and airing it back out over miles and stuff where people don't have to leave homes, can do it in their homes, can do it in their car. So the reach, the penetration, and if you put the ingredients together, right, ingredients being, the speaking, the musical programming, the religious programming, the political programming, if you can figure out a menu of all those options in a way that gives you a station identity, it becomes really, really important. I mean, the other, really, really powerful, whenever we would go to DC, every night I knew that starting around 7 o'clock, if I'm in DC, I'm listening to WHUR. Why? The Quiet Storm, which is where that genre of evening music was launched. Melvin, what's his name? I think he's dead now. So whenever I'm in DC, all the way up until probably the last 10 or 20 years or so, at 7 o'clock, if I'm near a radio, it's going to 96 point whatever, WHUR, the Quiet Storm, because that music And, lots of places now have picked up on the quiet storm as a motif, as a genre of music. It's quiet, lovely, whatever. And it was initiated at Howard. Now Howard then developed a school of communications, right? And they started doing TV and all kinds of stuff. But yeah, the intensification, expansion of the critical mindedness of Black cultural, Black conscience, etc., no pun intended, is amplified enormously by radio.
Yeah. So I'll bring us to a close here, but the question that we ask all of our narrators at the end of each interview, we think about this as memory work, the work that we do of preservation. So why does the HBCU Radio Preservation Project matter? And another way to think about that is like, what's lost if we don't preserve this history?
Well, again, if one of the most important things about history is the extent to which of doing history making, a recording of the making of history, is that it's an enormous resource critical to the evolution of human beings. And what I mean is, our lives are experimental. None of us are born knowing how to survive. Humans have to learn how to survive. We're not genetically programmed to survive. There's no genetic programming for farming, for manufacturing a car. I mean, all of this stuff has to be learned from scratch, has to be practiced and refined and corrected, figure out how to take the learning, digest it into a form where it can be passed on to the next generation where they don't have to start from scratch. That's why institutions of learning are so crucial. You keep moving the generations through, you digest, you learn, you write it down, you test it with them, they take it apart, put it in, and you keep iterating that. Well, if you don't have the repositories of distilled experience reflected upon, where people can say, well, how did this radio thing work before? Oh, go to the archives. Oh, you mean I ain't got to go try to start a radio? No, you might want to go read and listen to what happened before, try to figure out what worked well and what didn't. And now you can start out further on the learning scale than having to start from ground zero. So if you don't preserve to facilitate that critical reflection, review, and learning, et cetera, then you just condemn the next generation to ignorance and having to start from scratch. That's just not a good recipe for survival and flourishing. You want to try to position every generation to be further up on the we have learned scale based upon what others have done, so they don't have to go try to do this. You want to try to position every generation further along that learning than the generation that came before. And that's why those projects are so, so crucial. Otherwise, ignorance will fill the void. Well, we never did. What do you mean you never did? Yes, you did. Well, I didn't know. Of course you don't know, right? My generation started out thinking that only with the Black Power movement did we get, Black people who were radical. Everybody else was Tom. Bullshit. No, that's not true. But if there was a period where you didn't get taught that, it's easy to come along and think that if you thought of it, it's the first time it's been thought of. It's like, we have 3 sons, all 3 are married, 2 of them with kids. And sometimes, we listen to them, what they're trying to say to us about raising their kids. And my wife and I just kind of look at them and go, yeah, okay. All right. Oh, you think you're so smart about that now? Ah, okay, whatever. All right, if you want to know answers, we'll tell you. But and it's like, no, mom and dad, you don't understand. Like, how the hell do you think you all got along down the road of life? We raised 3 of you knuckleheads. And now you got a son, you're going to try to tell him we don't understand what it means to try to raise a son? Hell, okay, I wiped all 3 of your behinds and gave you baths. And now there's like, yeah, mom and dad, I see. Okay, all right, yeah, I understand. Yeah, yeah.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this interview, this two-part interview, but is there anything about your life that you wanted to speak to now for the record before we close? Anything we missed or who you want to shout out?
Not in particular. I think of myself as having a responsibility of one who has lived to be 80 years old and still going, and having spent time at 8 different colleges and universities, predominantly white, predominantly black, single sex co-ed, public, private, large, small, etc. So, I mean, I have a wealth of experience, and I take it to be my responsibility to digest it, learn, and share it with whomever wishes to partake of it, where they can sort through it and find what is worthwhile and what is not. And so, in that respect, I'm quite grateful for the honor of the interview and spending time with you talking about these matters. So, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's been a really great honor to learn from you, to be in conversation, and to hear your experiences at two very prominent HBCUs in this project. So, Dr. Lucius T. Outlaw Jr., I really do appreciate your time and wish you well.
Likewise, well, you take care and thank you.